This is a classic American series in the zombie genre, one that has taken us through countless twists and turns in its storyline, and among them, that resilient tough guy has undoubtedly become one of the most beloved characters for the audience. In search of his best friend Rick, Daryl once again became a loner and crossed the ocean to the distant country of France. At long last, after a year of anticipation, The Walking Dead, Daryl Dixon Season 2 has finally premiered, and this time, a fan-favorite character will reappear, none other than Carol, a familiar face to us all. The relationship between Daryl and Carol is complex and deep. They are not in a conventional romantic relationship, but rather share an intimacy that transcends friendship. Between them exists a bond of mutual reliance, respect, and profound care. What kind of story will their reunion bring? Let's dive right in.
I love you.
I love you too.
The story picks up from the final episode of The Walking Dead, Daryl Dixon, where Daryl ultimately decides not to leave, choosing instead to stay in the sanctuary and take on the role of mentor to Laurent, attempting to teach Laurent basic combat skills. At the same time, they receive disturbing news. Fallow's team, who previously aided Daryl and his companions, has been captured by Genet. This likely means Genet may resort to extreme measures to extract the coordinates of the sanctuary from Fallow and his team. Daryl believes they can no longer sit idly by. The longer they delay, the more dangerous the situation becomes for Fallow and his companions. They must act quickly to rescue Fallow from Genet's grasp. The leader of the Union of Hope, Lo Sung, agrees with Daryl's plan. However, after the meeting, Lo Sung has a private conversation with Daryl, expressing his concern about Daryl continuing to train Laurent. He worries that such training will only make Laurent more violent. It's clear that the sanctuary is a sacred place, where each person has their own unique beliefs, and Daryl's way of doing things doesn't quite fit in here. Meanwhile, Carol manages to track down Daryl's motorcycle from a man, and after some forceful questioning, she gets the location of the initial trade station where the motorcycle was found. Carol quickly makes her way to the station and states her intentions as soon as she arrives.
I'm a friendly buddy of mine. Got this bike from you guys, thought maybe you could help fix it.
You mixed lady?
Because Carol seemed harmless, Jones even mistook her for his companion's wife. However, Jones admits they know nothing about the motorcycle's structure. Carol then decides to find the owner of the motorcycle, as only the owner would be fully familiar with its condition. After some inquiries by Jones, it turns out that someone in the group does indeed know the motorcycle's owner.
Dixon.
Yes, the owner is Daryl Dixon, and Carol immediately recognizes Daryl's signature weapon, his crossbow. She starts asking about Daryl's whereabouts, but everyone here claims they don't know Daryl well. Despite their words, Carol notices they still talk about Dixon as a complete jerk in private. This makes Carol realize that they're trying to hide something about Dixon. Without hesitation, she grabs Daryl's crossbow and demands they reveal his whereabouts. Yet, even then, the men around her remain unfazed. Still seeing Carol as nothing more than a delicate woman, Carol promptly fires an arrow, piercing Drew's foot. At this moment, Jones seizes the opportunity to throw a weapon and interrupt Carol's attack. Grady steps forward, attempting to subdue Carol, only to have his nose broken by a swift counterattack. Only now do the men around them realize that this woman before them is no ordinary person, and Grady finally reveals Daryl's whereabouts.
They got themselves stored on a goddamn boat.
A boat? To where?
To France, okay?
According to him, a group of French visitors recently passed through this trade station. They were mainly collecting American zombies, and Daryl Dixon was also taken aboard their ship. They're unsure if that group of Frenchmen will return. Jones advises Carol to head north to the docks, where the large French ship might hold information about Dixon's situation. However, in the fight just now, the crossbow arrow pierced the tire of the motorcycle. Carol seizes Drew's car and, before leaving, informs them of her companion's location.
About a mile up the road, there's an old Dodge. Your buddy Mick is in the trunk. He's probably got about an hour's worth of air left, give or take.
Half an hour later, Carol arrived at the dock Jones had mentioned, but it seemed this place had long been abandoned. Even the seawater had completely receded, and once again, her lead was lost. Carol drove aimlessly down the empty road, uncertain of where to go next, let alone how she'd make it all the way to distant France. Frustrated, she switched through tapes in the car, trying to calm herself down, and that's when she suddenly noticed a plane in the sky not far off. In this post-apocalyptic world, airplanes had become an exceptionally rare sight. Carol wanted to observe the plane's direction but failed to notice the zombies on the road ahead. And in an instant, her car spun out of control, crashing into a roadside billboard. Hearing the noise, zombies quickly began surrounding her. But today's Carol was far from the weak woman she once was. Ordinary zombies posed no threat to her at all. After taking care of the zombies, the car was no longer drivable. So Carol set off on foot, determined to follow the trail of that mysterious plane. It was nearly midnight when Carol finally found the plane's landing site. She cautiously hovered outside the fence of the site and found that there was still a survivor inside. As she tried to get closer, she accidentally stepped on a twig, snapping it, and the man inside immediately went on alert. Luckily, Carol reacted quickly, crouching down at once. The man dismissed it, thinking it was just a small animal. After he walked away, Carol approached the front gate. A password lock had been installed, making a forced entry impossible. At that moment, a rabbit appeared and triggered a mechanism, causing a metal cage to drop from above. The bottom of the cage was strewn with human remains. It seemed others had tried to climb over the fence before, only to meet a grisly end. Carol appeared to have an idea. She cautiously climbed into the cage and then began shouting for help. The man inside the station soon heard her cries and came to investigate. Carol once again adopted a fragile demeanor, telling the man she wasn't looking for trouble. She explained that she had just been in a car accident and only hoped he could spare some medical supplies. She also tried to soften the man's attitude with some flattery. She told him he was a good man, the kind who wouldn't leave an injured woman to fend for herself. Hearing her compliments, the man started to waver, convinced by Carol's superb acting. The man with the gun felt pity, believing she was just a helpless woman in need of assistance.
You alone? You swear? I'll get you fixed up. Then you go.
He opened the gate and let Carol inside. Seeing her plan succeed, Carol let out a quiet sigh of relief. She followed the man into a small cabin, where she dabbed at the blood on her forehead with a towel, casually asking for his name. But the man remained cautious, standing at a distance with his hunting rifle. After a long pause, he finally answered that his name was Ash. Carol offered a brief introduction of her own. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker, and within seconds, the entire area was plunged into darkness.
What's that?
Problems with my generator?
After Ash spoke, he turned and left with his weapon, and Carol followed close behind. She watched as Ash reset a power switch, and soon the base was brightly lit again. When Ash turned back around, Carol quickly pretended to tend to her wound. Seeing her genuinely in need of help, Ash's demeanor softened, and he told Carol she could stay the night, suggesting she sleep in a nearby barn. Ash led the way toward the door, but Carol abruptly stopped in her tracks. The scene felt all too familiar. It was something Carol had never truly forgotten. Sophia, her only daughter when Carol found her back at the farm. Sophia had already turned into a zombie. That gut-wrenching pain came flooding back to Carol. In her mind, she saw her daughter approaching, reaching out to take her hand and calling her mom. Carol instinctively reached out, overwhelmed by guilt and grief. A gunshot pierced the nightmare, jolting Carol back to reality. Ash let go of her hand and asked Carol what was wrong with a concerned look. Only then did Carol come back to her senses, suppressing her sorrow, and replied that she was fine. Ash saw that Carol seemed off, but he didn't say much and simply led her into the barn. As soon as Carol entered, she headed straight forward, her eyes set on exactly what she had been looking for. There was an actual airplane here. All her effort to gain Ash's sympathy had been to get into the base and find this. Carol walked further into the room, casually glancing around at the setup inside. Ash shut the door behind her, locking it from the outside. After all, in a post-apocalyptic world, it was normal to be cautious around strangers. For a moment, Carol felt a twinge of guilt. Ash was undoubtedly a good person, and here she was, deceiving him by exploiting his kindness. The next morning, Ash unlocked the door, bringing in a tray of food. He placed it beside the bed and prepared to leave. Carol quickly sat up and asked Ash when he might have time to help repair her car. Ash glanced at the time and said he had something to take care of shortly. In the afternoon, he'd be flying out and could search for some spare parts along the way. Carol expressed her gratitude.
I hope I'm not keeping you. Guessing you have better things to do than to fly around here looking for car parts.
I have everything here.
Damn it.
Ash seemed to have delayed something. He hurriedly ran outside the house. Carol hid by the window. Watching him closely, she saw him stride toward a greenhouse, unlock a coded padlock, and head inside. This piqued Carol's curiosity. What was so important that it needed such protection? At 3 p.m., the plane took off right on schedule, the loud roar echoing overhead and attracting the wandering zombies in the forest, who began moving toward the gate. Left alone at the base, Carol's gaze shifted from the plane to the nearby greenhouse. She decided to take the opportunity to check it out. The greenhouse door was locked, so she peered through the yellowed glass. Inside, there were only some common crops. Why would Ash go to such lengths to keep it locked? With questions lingering, Carol returned to the room and began searching for any useful information. Finding Daryl was still her top priority. On a shelf, Carol found a world map and quickly pinpointed the location of France. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and the electricity went out. She headed outside, intending to reset the generator as Ash had done before. Just as she reached to push the button, Carol hesitated, realizing that a power cut would also unlock the greenhouse door. After a few moments of deliberation, Carol chose to investigate. What she forgot, however, was that the gate also malfunctioned due to the outage, allowing hordes of zombies to stream inside. Inside the greenhouse, a sophisticated irrigation system was cultivating an array of vegetables and plants. Nothing strange as Carol had suspected. She continued along the shelves, only to discover a tree at the very back, surrounded by toys on the ground. Looking closer, she noticed a photo of a young boy at the tree's base. Carol understood immediately. This was where Ash commemorated his son. The scattered toys on the ground reminded Carol of her own daughter, Sophia. Lost in her memories, Carol failed to notice the zombie horde that had entered the base and was closing in on her. She couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She missed her daughter every day, so she could truly empathize with Ash's feelings. But this was a sacred space that someone else had set up. She couldn't stay here any longer. She quickened her pace toward the exit. Just then, Carol scanned her surroundings and spotted a pair of scissors. She grabbed them, only to accidentally stab them into a zombie's mouth. She was forced to release them and retreat, seizing the opportunity to knock down a shelf, pinning two nearby zombies to the ground. Suddenly, the glass behind her shattered, and more zombies poured in from outside. Carol pressed against the wall, with zombies approaching from every direction. She knew she needed to break free quickly, or she'd be trapped. She planned to circle around to the back, only to turn and come face to face with a zombie. Luckily, she reacted swiftly, taking it down, but the zombies on the other side of the shelf also gathered around. There were too many for Carol to defeat in such a short time, so she desperately pulled a shelf in front of her as a barrier. The newly positioned shelf was soon forced open by the zombies, and she struggled to pull it back into place. She then turned to another shelf, dragging it over to block the opening, enclosing herself in a makeshift barricade at the center. More and more zombies gathered around, reaching through the gaps in the shelves, clawing toward her. Carol looked up at the skylight above her. Maybe it was her only chance to survive. Fortunately, the zombies crowding around the shelves just so happened to help stabilize the ladder, allowing her to climb up without incident. Carol reached up, broke the glass above her, and slipped out through the opening. But just then, Ash came walking over with his rifle in hand. Seeing the chaos, his anger was palpable.
What the hell did you do?
Carol felt deep guilt. After all, this mess had indeed started because of her. Half an hour later, they finished dealing with the zombies in the greenhouse and began the grueling task of cleaning up. Ash's anger did not subside at all. He even deliberately avoided Carol's help. He could hardly believe he'd let such trouble into his own home. He'd taken this woman in out of kindness, only for her to cause him such a massive headache.
Are you kidding me?
Please just let me clean it up.
Fine. Get out.
After saying this, Ash walked past Carol and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Carol felt a heavy weight of remorse. As a mother herself, she could fully understand Ash's emotions. An hour later, Carol finally tossed the last of the zombies outside the base, then returned to the greenhouse to repair the damage. When she entered, she saw Ash sitting in front of his son's memorial. Lost in thought, she hurried to apologize again, explaining that her curiosity had gotten the best of her, and she hadn't meant for things to get so out of hand. She'd come to learn more about his life, maybe even make a friend. Hearing this, Ash finally spoke, coldly saying he didn't need friends. Protecting this place was his entire life. After a brief silence, Carol told him she would leave once she finished cleaning up. Perhaps because he hadn't spoken about the past in a long time, Ash suddenly began to share about his son, the grief pouring out. With Carol as his only listener, Ash had raised his son, Avi, alone. But when the apocalypse struck, tragedy followed. Due to his mistake, Avi had run outside. In the end, he couldn't save his own son. In remorse and self-blame, he built this place to commemorate his son. Since Avi had loved airplanes, Ash had hung model planes all over the branches. Coincidentally, a plane had crashed nearby, which Ash took as a sign from his son. He spent months repairing and restoring the plane, and after nearly half a year, it could finally fly.
You don't want to leave him. That's why you fly around here.
It was never about going anywhere in particular. Just up high enough that when I look down, I can almost trick myself into thinking the world is...
Carol was moved by Ash's story, and her remorse for damaging the greenhouse grew. Wanting to do something to make it up to him, Carol spent more time patching up the walls. When Ash approached, Carol proactively explained her actions.
Hey, I'm just about finished here. You know, if it's okay with you, I'll head out in the morning.
I'm about to sit down for dinner, if you would like to join me.
I like that.
She was a bit surprised, as this seemed to signal Ash's willingness to forgive her. Still, Carol continued working until nightfall before finally returning to her room. Upon entering, she was stunned to see that Ash had prepared a meal for her. There was even a bouquet of white flowers on the table.
I believe this one. Bloom for your little girl.
Carol came back from her memories, not knowing how that seemingly aloof but kind-hearted man was doing. Just then, Ash came over and asked Carol what her plans were from now on, but Carol said she didn't know. She knew she needed Ash's help to get to France to find Daryl, but she didn't know how to ask, so she began sharing her story of surviving the apocalypse. She talked about her failed marriage and abusive husband, and how her daughter Sophia had been the only bright spot in her life. Hearing about her child, Ash's interest grew, and he asked where Sophia was now. Hearing this, Carol froze. She didn't reveal the painful experience and instead changed her story on the spot.
And then, when everything happened, I tried to reach her a bunch of times and never heard from her.
You don't need your car fixed. You want me to fly you to France to find your daughter. So you lied to me.
If you knew Avi was out there, wouldn't you do anything, whatever it took to find him?
But he's not.
Carol's attempt to probe had failed. She'd even used her deceased daughter to try to gain this father's sympathy. Although Ash was kind, he was also perceptive. Carol's little ploy had clearly backfired. The more Ash thought about it, the angrier he became. After only a few bites, he set down his utensils and left. The next morning, Carol woke up early, ready to leave. The plane was parked right by the barn door, but she knew she'd lost the privilege of borrowing it. She could only strap on her crossbow and set out to find another way. Ash stood outside the greenhouse, watching Carol as she left. Then he turned back and continued polishing the glass. Carol didn't dare say goodbye. She simply turned and walked away in silence. Just as she walked towards the intersection with disappointment, a pickup truck suddenly drove up and stopped quickly in front of her. It was Ash. He'd come after her, letting out a deep sigh before speaking.
I would do anything to find Avi. I mean, what parent wouldn't? But that's not the question. The question is, would you search for him? Would you give up everything to look for somebody you haven't met?
Yes, it's my only option.
Why now? What changed?
Feeling stuck. I had to move forward. I had to try.
Carol's words struck a chord with Ash. In fact, his coming after her meant he'd been thinking the same thing. So, he started up the pickup and told her to get in. They had a lot to prepare before heading to France. Carol let out a breath of relief, surprised that after everything, Ash was still willing to help her. 10 minutes later, they were back at the base. Ash pointed to a map, analyzing the flight route. Since the plane couldn't handle long-distance travel, they'd need to stop over in Greenland and also replace the ethanol tanks with fuel tanks. Only then did Carol realize that they still needed to find enough fuel. Unexpectedly, Ash took her directly to a wooden house, which was full of gasoline barrels. With the crucial fuel issue solved, they started gathering food supplies. Ash asked Carol where she planned to start searching once they reached France. Carol quickly replied that she'd begin at her aunt's house.
Wouldn't that be amazing?
I have to remind myself there's a chance she won't be. She may not even still be alive.
Yeah, but she could be. I'm glad you still have that.
She nodded, but guilt churned in her chest. She used Sophia to gain Ash's sympathy, solely to get him to help her. As Ash worked on modifying the fuel lines, Carol couldn't help but approach him to ask,
You sure you want to do this? Leave this place? Leave Avi?
In truth, Carol was having second thoughts. Finding Daryl was her own obsession, but with so much unknown ahead, she couldn't promise that she and Ash would both make it out safely. Ash reassured her that it didn't matter. He admitted that he hadn't dared to leave his home for a long time after his son's death, but this plane had rekindled a sense of hope, giving him the courage to start a new life. Just when they thought everything was going smoothly, the weather suddenly changed. It looked like a storm was coming. They decided to load the supplies onto the plane now and wait until the weather cleared tomorrow before setting off. As they moved the fuel drums, they speculated about the state of the apocalypse in France. Just then, a flash of lightning struck a nearby lamppost, causing a short circuit that sent sparks flying. Moments later, the entire base was plunged into darkness. They were about to go check on the power when suddenly, the hut where the fuel was stacked exploded. Ash and Carol froze in place, not even noticing that the short circuit had affected the main gate as well. Zombies were pouring in, just like they had earlier in the day. Ash walked quickly forward. He looked at the surrounding fire and quickly made a decision. He glanced toward the nearby woods, where, sure enough, more zombies were making their way toward them. Ash grew even more anxious. If they didn't leave now, neither of them would survive. Their only option was to take the plane and leave with whatever supplies they had left. They pushed the plane out onto an open stretch of ground. Carol set down her weapon, preparing to clear a path, but there was no time. If they didn't take off immediately, the horde of zombies would soon trap them. Carol had just removed the chalk from the front wheel when a zombie appeared from behind. She barely managed to fend off its attack, shoving it away before rushing back to the plane. She climbed in along the wing, quickly putting on noise-canceling headphones and closing her eyes in silent prayer. The plane began to accelerate down the makeshift runway, but zombies crowded the path ahead, filling them with dread. They had no idea if the plane could withstand the collisions. Carol's hands were clammy with sweat, but thankfully, the plane took off smoothly, and they managed to escape the encircling horde. But she still couldn't bring herself to open her eyes. After all, this was her first time on a plane and under the most chaotic circumstances. Ash, however, was unfazed. He glanced down at the shrinking base below, then spoke up to reassure the visibly tense Carol. Will they make it to France safely? The young boy looked ahead in terror as a horde of zombies moved toward him. Luckily, he had a machete in his hand to barely defend himself, but, due to his small size, he could only swing wildly at the zombies in front of him. In the next second, Laurent stumbled and fell while trying to dodge the zombies. Seeing the zombies about to lunge, all he could do was frantically back away. Just then, the zombies were suddenly pulled back by a mechanism. It turned out to be a false alarm. After securing the ropes, Daryl picked up his spear. In fact, it's only been 2 weeks since Daryl returned to the nest, and he trains Laurent with zombies every day. Since battle experience could only be gained in rail combat, Daryl had to ensure Laurent could protect himself. After all, Judith and the others had learned these skills at an early age. Laurent was very satisfied with his life now. The nest did indeed provide abundant resources, but more importantly, Daryl's staying gave him a real sense of home. At that moment,
Laurent! Laurent, t'es en retard pour ton cours de philo.
Je suis obligée d'y aller.
Lozang insiste. And you should head back as well. Lozang would like to speak with you.
All right.
Lausanne gathered everyone in the Nest Chapel for a meeting. Just now, news came from the Paris division that their camp had been attacked. and 3 people were captured by Genet's forces: Martin, Falou, and Emile. Sylvie was filled with anxiety upon hearing the news Emile was her boyfriend. Isabelle quickly added that these were the very people who had helped them escape Paris, hoping the Nest could figure out a way to help.
Mathis, your scouts are on the way.
I hope to have a report soon.
And until then what? We do nothing.
Sylvie.
We have to save them.
We will. We need to be patient.
Patience won't work. Genet can't get anything from him. She'll just kill him.
Lo Zhang's face stiffened. No one had ever publicly contradicted him like that. He quickly promised to do everything possible and then hastily dismissed the meeting. As everyone was leaving with heavy expressions, Daryl was stopped by Lo Zhang. With his smile now gone, Lo Zhang asked Daryl how long he planned to stay here. Daryl thought Lo Zhang might be testing him, so he straightforwardly replied that he'd leave when the next opportunity arose. Unexpectedly, Lo Zhang had a condition this time, saying, "I can help arrange your route, but you must agree to one thing. Stop training Laurent to kill zombies. This child is destined for great things and shouldn't be distracted by these matters."
More than staying alive.
Yes, actually. Maintaining empathy. I worry about the impact of repeated violence on him. No offense.
None taken.
Everyone here has a place, if they choose to seek it out. I hope you'll find yours here too.
Daryl understood Lo Zhang thought his approach was too violent and criticized him for potentially leading the kid down a bad path, but it had been 13 years since the apocalypse began, and teaching kids how to fight zombies was only a precaution. Different ways, different views. Daryl didn't feel like explaining further and simply walked away. 5 minutes later, Daryl, still puzzled, found Isabelle and recounted what Lo Zhang had said. Isabelle didn't see any issue with Daryl's training. Giving a kid some self-defense skills seemed perfectly normal. However, she also thought Lo Zhang might have other reasons. Perhaps Daryl's talents were being underutilized by spending all his time with the kid. Daryl realized he might have overthought it, but he could clearly feel that he didn't quite fit in here. Maybe he should try to do something to integrate better. Hearing Isabelle's opinion that this was a good place to live, Daryl shifted the topic, saying he'd been thinking a lot lately about his family and friends far back in America, wondering how they were doing. If Daryl knew that Carol was on her way to find him, who knows what he'd feel. The next day, Daryl took the initiative to go to the training room. Lo Zhang was sparring with 2 men, showcasing impressive combat skills as he easily took down his sparring partners. Seeing Lo Zhang free for a moment, Daryl took the opportunity to state his intentions.
Heard Mathis got word back.
Genet's transporting them from Maison Mère to another facility in a few days. Mathis's team will intercept the transport.
Lo Zhang looked troubled and said, "I understand you want to help, but the Union of Hope advocates peace and opposes violence." In other words, he didn't want Daryl's involvement to escalate the fighting. Daryl replied that he felt the same. He wouldn't resort to violence unless necessary. Seeing that Daryl didn't catch his subtle hint, Lo Zhang specifically showed him the wooden staff he held. He used this staff to practice Aikido purely for self-defense, never for harming others.
When you want to punch back?
There's a time and a place for everything.
Since Daryl hadn't picked up on his indirect refusal, Lo Zhang finally agreed to Daryl's request. He had also heard that Daryl's combat skills were exceptional, and perhaps Daryl could even become a main force in the team.
Care to go around?
Not with that toothpick.
After a long pause, Lo Zhang realized Daryl was only joking and nodded in farewell. Daryl, pretending to be casual, took another look at Lo Zhang. This leader, with his roundabout way of speaking, was far less straightforward than he appeared. 2 days later, Daryl joined the team as they arrived at a village and spread out to find ambush positions. Team leader Mathis walked over, checked the time, and began explaining the battle plan. The first vehicle coming through would trigger a roadside bomb, blocking the convoy behind it in the alley. Then, they could launch an attack and rescue the hostages. Daryl listened and nodded, indicating his agreement. Then, they waited for Genet's convoy to arrive. Time sped by, and a teammate signaled that the convoy was about to arrive at the battlefield. Soon, 3 cars come to the intersection. Unexpectedly, Genet happens to be sitting in the first car. Everyone was poised to strike, but...
It didn't blow. We should have watched. What are you doing?
Before Mathis even finished speaking, Daryl opened fire, and with the 3rd shot, he killed the driver, continuing his assault. Only when the first vehicle lost control and flipped over did Daryl signal his teammates to charge in. The sudden start of the battle caught both sides off guard. Seeing the soldiers fall, the team rushed toward the transport vehicle, startling the people inside. Mathis quickly said that they were all from the Union of Hope. At that moment, Daryl suddenly felt he'd missed something, but with the primary goal being to rescue the hostages, they had to move quickly. As Daryl reached out to help the next person, he noticed that Fallu was already injured, his face filled with terror, likely the result of torture while in captivity. As Daryl helped Fallu toward the car, he finally remembered what he had overlooked. He hadn't checked whether the people in the first vehicle were dead or injured. Just then, someone staggered beside the car. It was Genet, her head bloody from the crash. Yet laughing maniacally, Daryl raised his gun and moved forward. This was a perfect chance to kill Genet. Daryl didn't care about what she was saying. He just wanted to put a bullet in this woman. Genet even struck a defiant pose, unfazed by the gun pointed at her. When Daryl came back to his senses, he was instantly stunned. There was no longer any trace of Genet by the car. For a moment, he thought it was all an illusion. Meanwhile, Jacinta approached Losang and urged him to hold the ceremony early. Since Laurent had arrived at the nest, they should announce the coming of the savior to everyone, but Losang insisted they still needed to wait. As Laurent wasn't yet prepared, Jacinta was frustrated, feeling that Losang was always hesitant on this issue. Once they elevated Laurent, the Union of Hope would attract more followers, and they could handle the next steps themselves. Yet Losang still refused, since as soon as the ceremony took place, Laurent would gain significant authority, and they couldn't be certain he would side with them. Laurent, of course, had no knowledge of the ceremony plans. He just felt happy with life here. All the residents cared for him, and he wanted to help turn this place into a wonderful family.
Ils sont revenus.
Laurent ran eagerly toward the entrance, the sound of the bell signaling Daryl's return. The vehicle soon came to a stop in the open area, and Sylvie approached with hopeful eyes, embracing her long-separated boyfriend tightly, though Emile stared blankly, showing no reaction to her concern. At that moment, Laurent rushed out to meet Daryl, and they returned together, laughing and chatting, relieved that the mission had gone relatively smoothly. In between his studies, Laurent wished Daryl could teach him how to throw knives. Losang was puzzled when he heard this. Did Laurent really want Daryl to stay? Losang started to lecture on religious principles, but Laurent was clearly distracted. Laurent honestly replied that Daryl had things to teach him. Losang paused for a moment but ultimately let Laurent go, surprised that Daryl had ignored his warning and continued teaching Laurent about fighting.
Il repartira un jour, Daryl. Qu'est-ce qu'on fera alors si Laurent veut partir aussi?
Daryl finira bien par se laisser convaincre. Il y a des gens qui ont besoin de temps.
Du temps, n'en a pas.
Jacinta, one of the nest's highest-ranking members, held authority second only to Losang. Her insistence on holding the ceremony early stemmed from growing unrest within the Union of Hope. Many followers felt they weren't being protected, and after being attacked by Genet's forces, they were left to passively wait for rescue. If this continued, people would abandon their faith and wouldn't fight for the Union of Hope. Only the Savior's appearance could restore morale and secure the Alliance's control. This time, Losang was persuaded. He looked out the window at Laurent and Daryl, silently consenting to Jacinta's plan. In the previous episode, Ash decided to go to France with Carol. Due to a sudden change in the weather, they left the base at night. Their plane skimmed over the mountains, trailing smoke, and luckily landed on a nearby field. Carol and Ash climbed out of the cabin, ready to take a short break here. Since there was a minor issue with the fuel line, Ash planned to find some tools to make repairs.
Getting over my surprise, we're still alive.
Just as he finished speaking, Ash's expression suddenly changed. Several zombies were approaching from not far away. It must have been the noise from the plane that alerted them. Carol suggested they split up. Ash would stay to fix the plane, while she'd take up arms to eliminate the zombies. The zombies seemed to move slowly, maybe due to the vegetation growing on them. Carol raised her crossbow and skillfully landed a shot to a zombie's head. Although this wasn't Carol's usual weapon, fighting alongside Daryl for so long had made her quite familiar with using a crossbow. Soon, only one zombie was left. Carol calmly lifted her hand. Suddenly, a zombie burst out from the grass. Carol quickly drew her knife to stab it, only to be grabbed from behind by another zombie that had emerged. Seizing her wrist, Ash heard the commotion and rushed over to help Carol, freeing her from danger, but he himself got caught by a zombie. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. leaving them both stunned. They looked in the direction the bullet came from, spotting a woman on the mountaintop who had just lowered her gun and was now waving to them. Soon, the two groups joined up and introduced themselves. The woman with short hair introduced herself as Hannah. She was the one who had just saved Ash with her shot. The woman with curly hair was named Un, and she was the leader of the camp. They had heard the roar of the plane and followed the road, surprised to find it had landed in that patch of wild grass. That area was full of mutated zombies. During their dormant period, the zombies would blend with the vegetation, then ambush any living creatures that passed by, like carnivorous plants. They were also curious why Carol and Ash had flown in, as they hadn't seen outsiders for years. Ash quickly explained,
The crack in the fuel line is more like a nightmare for us.
You think you can fix it?
Yeah, it's nothing but a patch-up job. Shouldn't be too hard if I can find the right supplies.
I'm sure we've got something you'll be able to use. There.
After another half hour, the group finally arrived at the camp. Hannah and Un casually lowered their guns, leading Ash and Carol inside to rest. They hadn't expected to find such a large skull boiling in the pot. Carol was taken aback, and Ash quickly averted his gaze. When Un mentioned finding repair materials, Ash snapped out of it and nodded, ready to follow her to the storage room. Carol stayed behind alone. Hannah warmly invited Carol to make herself at home. Carol set down her weapon and started casually exploring the room. Standing next to a pile of lab equipment, Hannah picked up some homemade liquor and invited Carol to have a drink. Carol smiled and said she'd try it in a bit, then wandered over to a storage cabinet. Seemingly intrigued by life in this place, Hannah heard this and put down her glass, saying they were all climate research PhD students who had come to this camp to track glacial melting. Originally, they only planned to stay for 3 months, but when the apocalypse hit, they were trapped here.
To be like it's Mother Nature fighting back. Never screw with somebody's mother.
Carol didn't dare to respond further. She found Hannah's thought process a bit hard to digest. Just then, Ash returned, bringing with him a perfectly preserved roll of tape.
You want some help?
Sure.
Carol and Ash suddenly felt something strange, but since the others didn't seem to mean them any harm, it was likely just a well-intentioned warning. As Ash and Un left the room, Carol suddenly asked for a drink. Hearing this, Hannah readily agreed, and the two began to chat again over their drinks.
You mind?
Not if you're careful.
Hannah immediately reached for the crossbow, bringing it close to herself and examining it carefully. She seemed quite curious about how the weapon worked, and even loaded the arrow she had been toying with earlier. Carol's sense of foreboding grew stronger and stronger, watching as Hannah set the crossbow on the table. Carol gripped the metal all tightly. Hannah slowly turned the crossbow, aiming it in Carol's direction, her expression blank-faced as she stared at Carol. Just an hour earlier, Ash and Un had returned to the plane's landing site. On the way, they discussed his and Carol's purpose for flying to France. Carol was going to search for her daughter, but Ash was troubled. After so many years in the apocalypse, the chances of a child surviving were incredibly slim. He didn't know how to tell her the truth, yet despite the odds, he had set out for France with her, determined to take that faint chance. Un was clearly moved by his courage. After a moment of silence, she asked if he had any children. Seeing Ash's expression of regret and guilt, Un quickly set her gun aside and embraced him. Half an hour later, Ash was working on repairs to the plane, with Un standing nearby, watching.
You ever thought about having more?
More what?
Children.
Ash thought Un was joking. When he turned to look at her, he realized she was earnestly waiting for an answer. With a serious expression, he shared his true thoughts, saying he didn't believe this apocalyptic world was suited for bringing new life into it.
Humans would die out like we were never here. That's what Hannah wants, for civilization to end.
Ash looked at Un in confusion, wondering how his thoughts had suddenly escalated to the question of human extinction. Un said that she and Hannah had different views. She believed that human civilization should be preserved and continued, so she wanted Ash to help her. Ash snapped back to reality, hardly able to believe his ears. He felt that he must have misunderstood. Ash couldn't think of anything other than absurdity. He just felt that his values had been impacted. After a long pause, he directly refused, but Un's expression instantly turned fierce. She had already told him there was no one else around, so why couldn't this man just listen? Ash took a deep breath, found an excuse, and said that the plane was already repaired. To his surprise, Boone lowered the hunting rifle and aimed it at him. Meanwhile, back at the camp, Carol felt helpless, as Hannah still wouldn't put down the crossbow. She had no choice but to keep chatting, hoping to understand the reason behind this. "If you don't want to kill me, then why are you so set on fulfilling your friend's wager?" she asked. But Hannah replied that she had always followed Un's instructions, and besides, this was also helping fulfill Un's wish. Carol took the opportunity to ask,
You must want something? I do. You can come with us. You're just saying that to save your life. I'm offering you an opportunity to save yours. Now, how often does a plane land outside of the shithole?
Hannah just shook her head, saying she and Un had to rely on each other, but it was clear she was wavering. Seeing this, Carol promised her, "Let's go find Ash together. Once he finishes repairing the plane, we can leave here, and you'll be free to do whatever you want."
Hannah? At the plane, he's fine.
Just listen. Shut up!
Do what I goddamn tell you, I do it myself.
Hannah broke down in tears, gasping for breath as she struggled to calm herself. Carol looked back, shaken. This turn of events was completely beyond anything she had expected. An hour later, as night began to fall, Carol and Hannah reached the plane's landing site, keeping their weapons close as they guarded against zombies lurking in the thick fog. Carol felt sorry for Hannah. She had been trapped in this oppressive environment for so long that it seemed to have affected her mind. Now that Un was dead, the only chance Hannah had to survive was to leave this place. The plane was parked not far away, but they had no idea what Ash's current situation was. Carol turned back in shock. Seeing Ash standing by the plane holding a flare gun, Carol was momentarily stunned. The flare hit Hannah in a fatal spot. She had no chance of survival. Watching the flames gradually die out, Carol could only turn and walk away. Ash looked just as shaken, allowing Carol to help remove his handcuffs. The plane took off smoothly, accelerating away from this place. They tacitly did not mention what had just happened. Carol also hid the truth about Hannah, though Hannah didn't deserve to die. To Ash, she was an accomplice, and Carol didn't want to add to his burden. It was best to let things return to normal. Daryl's team successfully rescued their comrades, but after enduring interrogations, they were left mentally and physically scarred. Emile, especially, seemed unresponsive even to his girlfriend's concern. The next day, Sylvie took Emile to the garden to get some sun and give him a haircut to lift his spirits. However, there was no joy in the reunion of this young couple. Instead, they seemed unusually distant. Emile's heavy expression persisted, and he refused to talk about what he'd gone through, no matter how Sylvie pressed him. It wasn't until Sylvie started anxiously searching for wounds under his shirt that Emile finally reacted.
J'ai fait un pacte avec Dieu pour qu'il me ramène à toi.
Et il t'a entendu. Il nous a entendus tous les deux.
On the other side, Laurent was feeling frustrated. He had just started relaxing and playing for a bit when he was called back to class. Daryl had been keeping an eye on Laurent's state, so he brought out a baseball to help Laurent relax. But recently, for some reason, Laurent's classes have become very intensive. Daryl didn't see the need to push Laurent so hard. Some of these lessons were simply too advanced for him to understand, and without comprehension, there'd be no real learning or belief.
You should question things. Be skeptical. Who am I then?
They're like us.
What does us mean? In a week or two, whenever you figure out a plan, you'll be gone and we'll stay here.
Daryl fell silent after hearing this. In truth, he and Isabelle had feelings for each other, but bringing such feelings to light would mean taking on the responsibilities that follow. After some careful consideration, Daryl tentatively spoke up.
You could make a different choice. You could come with me. Both of you.
The next morning, Isabelle woke up early to rouse Laurent from the neighboring room, but after knocking for a long time with no response, she pushed the door harder. Laurent was gone from his room, chairs were toppled, and the window was open. There had clearly been a struggle. Realizing Laurent was in danger, Isabelle quickly turned to seek help. Daryl soon arrived and rushed into the room to look for clues. A rope was hanging from the windowsill, and traces of sand nearby indicated someone had entered and taken Laurent away. Just then, Jacinta arrived at the scene with a guard. 10 minutes later, Everyone gathered at the gate, readying themselves for the upcoming fight. Jacinta handed a few shells to the soldiers. Daryl casually took the long gun and then accepted the rounds, loading them into the barrel. Meanwhile, the injured Fallow insisted on joining the mission. Emile immediately tried to dissuade him, but Fallow was determined to do his part, slipping past him and getting into the vehicle at the back. Sylvie saw that her boyfriend's condition had improved, so she took off her necklace and put it on Emile. Just then, Isabelle walked over, armed and ready. The vehicles quickly started up and prepared to set off. Losung stood beside Jacinta, watching Daryl and the others drive away with a serious expression. Half an hour later, the convoy passed through a forest, when one of the soldiers in the backseat knocked on the door and pointed to the bushes, saying he saw something. Before the car even stopped, he jumped out and picked up an empty fuel canister by the roadside. Daryl walked over, carefully examining the ground. It looks like 2 or 3 people stayed here briefly, then left along the path ahead, to gather more clues. They had no choice but to proceed on foot and check out the situation. Soon, Daryl's team arrived in front of a building, where they hid behind cover to observe the situation. At his signal, everyone stood up, determined to avoid alerting the enemy as much as possible. As soon as they entered the front door, they heard movement above, and then a shadow flashed by. They had been detected, but it was inevitable. Daryl patted a teammate's shoulder, signaling him to follow and block the adjacent corridor, while the others spread out to search. Isabelle and Emile remained at the entry point to guard the only way in or out. Daryl held his rifle up as he cautiously made his way up the stairs. Fortunately, there were no traps at the stairwell, and upstairs there were only some large machines placed around. Daryl thoroughly checked each corner, while his teammate followed with his gun raised. But Daryl didn't notice that the 2 men were slowly pulling out the daggers at their waists. The bullets turned out to be blanks. Realizing this, Daryl quickly used the butt of his gun to hit one man's head, then dragged him toward the window. Hearing a scream, Fallow immediately took cover against the wall as his opponent charged forward with a drawn knife. Fallow shot down the nearest attacker, but another leaped at him, and they instantly grappled. Meanwhile, Daryl was also fighting hand-to-hand, slamming his opponent into the wall by his collar. At that moment, an archer aimed at Daryl from the stairs. Daryl quickly pulled his opponent in front of him to take the arrow, but he had no time to dodge the next shot. Isabelle stepped out from a corner, and Daryl quickly thanked her before continuing up the stairs only to find another person waiting at the top. Isabelle glanced at the woman at her feet and called out to Daryl, saying she'd seen this person before in the stables at headquarters. This meant the enemies in the building were imposters, and they would have to be doubly cautious. Before long, Isabelle and Daryl reached the top floor. As soon as Daryl peered around the corner, an arrow was shot at him. As the archer was loading another arrow, Daryl charged forward, with Isabelle close behind, firing her gun, but the bullet didn't hit any vital spots, and the man on the ground still tried to resist, but Daryl's blow was purely out of anger. Today had truly pushed him to the brink first. His ammunition was switched out, and then his teammates suddenly betrayed him. If Isabelle hadn't insisted on coming along, he might not have made it out alive. But Daryl and Isabelle couldn't figure out why the Union of Hope had gone to such lengths to set them up. There was no time to dwell on it. They still had to check on the others. Fallow was in rough shape. His injuries hadn't fully healed, and within moments he was tackled to the ground by a man who then grabbed him by the throat. The man raised his dagger, ready to kill him, and Fallow could only struggle desperately, trying to fend him off. Just then, Emile approached from a short distance away. Fallow immediately shouted for help, begging Emile to shoot, but strangely, Emile showed no intention of helping him. Fallow couldn't hold on much longer. Using his last bit of strength, he grabbed an arrow from the ground and stabbed it into the man's neck. With the immediate danger over, Fallow took a long moment to catch his breath and get back up only to find Emile pointing a gun at him. Daryl and Isabelle had no choice but to lower their weapons. They asked Emile why he was doing this, seeing that the rest were all acquaintances. Emile hesitated for a long time before finally revealing the truth. The Union of Hope feared that Laurent might leave with Daryl. If the Union lost its symbol of hope, it wouldn't be long before it fell apart. So the leadership had decided to eliminate Daryl. The plan was foolproof until Isabelle and Fallow insisted on coming along, but they were still confused. They had once been through life and death together. How could Emile betray them so suddenly? Emile was still a young soldier, and after facing life and death, his thinking had grown extreme. He believed that the current killing was all for the success of the Union of Hope. As long as the Union of Hope ceremony went forward tomorrow, everyone would believe that Laurent was the savior.
That he represents a future where we can no longer be hurt by les affamis.
They're gonna test him.
Tomorrow it will be proven he will not succumb to the bite. And all doubt will be dispelled.
It turned out that this was the Union's real purpose. All they needed was someone immune to the zombie virus. The role of savior was just a symbolic image, created to spread the message among the followers. Emile seemed to waver as he learned the truth. Fallu seized the opportunity to urge Emile to turn back, but a hand reached down and picked up the gun before Emile could. It was Isabelle, the closest one. Daryl quickly raised his gun, staying alert. Emile, realizing there was no way out, accepted his fate with calm. He held the pendant Sylvie had given him, waiting for release. In the previous episode, it turned out that Laurent had never gone missing at all. It was all a trap set by the Union of Hope. Their true aim was to catch Daryl off guard and kill him. Fortunately, Fallu stepped in just in time to defuse the crisis. Yet Emile remained stubbornly loyal, trusting a high-ranking female leader within the Union of Hope without question. Isabelle, realizing he was beyond saving, swallowed her sorrow and pulled the trigger. Meanwhile, Sylvie entered the kitchen carrying a tray. She noticed a woman preparing food. This would have been a normal thing, but Sylvie suddenly felt something was wrong. The bread being prepared was baked individually, a rare occurrence, as everyone normally ate together at scheduled times, and food was only specially prepared under unique circumstances. Sylvie slipped behind a column to observe. The woman picked up the tray and started walking out, clearly intending to deliver the meal to someone specific. Once the woman walked away, Sylvie quietly followed her. Unexpectedly, the woman was quite vigilant, constantly looking back. Sylvie trailed her from a distance. Sylvie followed her to a secluded corner of the castle, where the woman approached a small door at the end of a hallway. She set the tray on the ground, knocked on the door, then turned and left. Sylvie quickly hid behind a wall to avoid being seen. Before long, the small door opened and a man took away the tray. Now there were more and more questions. After mentally preparing herself, Sylvie cautiously approached the small door, intending to slip inside and uncover the truth. Unexpectedly, there was a staircase below, along with several connected secret rooms. Sylvie's heart instantly lifted, as she guessed who was hiding here.
Sylvie? Nous sommes à l'aube de quelque chose de merveilleux.
That evening, Daryl and the others reached the opposite shore of the Union of Hope, but the tide hadn't yet receded from the bay. They had no choice but to set up camp on the shore and wait through the night. Fallu planned to scout the area, leaving Daryl and Isabelle some time alone. Isabelle reflected on the current situation. For years, she had held steadfast to the prophecy of a savior, believing that reaching the Union of Hope would lead to salvation. Yet now, she realized it had all been an illusion, a scheme crafted by politicians to win people's loyalty. Isabelle's life goal was actually quite simple: to fulfill her sister's dying wish and take care of Laurent. However, through a series of coincidences, she mistakenly thought she also bore some greater purpose.
Don't worry, when the water goes back out, we'll go in and get him.
And then I'll go with you. If the offer still stands.
Daryl nodded and agreed to Isabelle, as this was exactly what he had hoped for, to take Isabelle and Laurent back to Alexandria. That way, they could escape the gang wars in this place and be free from the constraints of those so-called doctrines.
Like a nice change of scenery. Makes you look at things a different way.
The paysan. I like that.
Inside the Union of Hope Church, Lo-Sung was anxiously worrying about the upcoming ceremony when Jacinta entered the room to report on that day's actions.
Are you doubting the plan?
We'll go through with the test. It will work, but we'll still have to deal with Daryl when he comes back.
He's not coming back.
Lo-Sung froze in surprise. What did she mean? Jacinta went on to explain that she'd taken it upon herself to alter the plan. Originally, they had only planned to distract Daryl to buy time for the ceremony, but she told her subordinates that Laurent was immune to the zombie virus and mentioned that Daryl would interfere with the ceremony, suggesting it would be best to find an opportunity to kill him. Lo-Sung took a deep breath, suppressing the anger welling up inside him.
What about the others? Isabelle. Fallu.
They were not part of the plan.
Jacinta added that it was precisely his prophecy that had inspired followers and led to the founding of the Union of Hope. They'd fought for this for so long they couldn't allow one individual to obstruct the alliance's development, their hands clasped tightly together, signaling that Losung had also cast aside his last shred of conscience, now standing firmly alongside Jacinta. The next morning, the Union of Hope began setting up the ceremony venue. Sylvie sat by the window, silently praying for God to grant her the courage she needed to protect Laurent. Ever since she'd been discovered sneaking into the secret room the day before, Losung had sent her back to her room, where she was now under soft confinement. Just then, there was a knock on the door. Sylvie took a deep breath to calm herself, then walked over to answer. It turned out to be a familiar guard delivering breakfast. Sylvie quickly reached out to take it, setting it aside, and struck up some small talk with him before he closed the door. The guard also knew what Sylvie wanted to find out.
Losung dit que c'est provisoire. Une fois que le garçon aura survécu à sa morsure, la preuve sera faite.
Je sais.
Seeing how cooperative this young nun was, the guard relaxed his vigilance and prepared to leave. Suddenly, Sylvie grabbed the guard by the neck and slammed him against the wall, knocking him out with a precise blow. She hurriedly locked the door, then rushed toward Laurent's room, but when Sylvie opened the door, Laurent wasn't there. Could Losung have moved him to a different location? She quickly turned and dashed outside. Sylvie slapped Losung's hand away and demanded to know where he was hiding Laurent. Taking advantage of the moment, Jacinta signaled for the subordinates to restrain Sylvie. Seeing this, Sylvie immediately ran off, shouting accusations of the group's evil deeds as she went. Losung sighed helplessly when he failed to catch Sylvie, but Jacinta's soldiers quickly pursued. Sylvie had no choice but to flee blindly, yet her path was suddenly blocked by more soldiers up ahead. She had nowhere left to run. Seeing the situation under control, Losung began calling out to Sylvie, urging her to comply and wait until the ceremony was over. Hearing this, Sylvie panicked even more. She had to find Laurent and let the savior reveal the truth. Only then would people believe. Losung maintained his pretense of acting for the greater good, coaxing Sylvie to calm down and stop causing trouble. Just as Sylvie was about to retort, the soldiers seized her. Losung looked on in shock. This was a turn of events he hadn't expected at all. He quickly checked Sylvie's pulse, but it was clear she was already beyond saving. Just like that, Sylvie had died unexpectedly. The residents, once they realized what had happened, gathered around to mourn the fallen. An hour later, 3 figures appeared outside the castle walls. Daryl and his group had finally arrived. Fallow led Daryl and Isabelle to a rock face, planning to climb over the wall and slip inside quietly. With Union of Hope heavily guarded, they had no chance of winning a direct confrontation. They needed to find Laurent first and then plan their next steps. Meanwhile, Laurent sat quietly in the dining hall, waiting. When he saw someone coming, he immediately jumped off the table. This signaled that the ceremony was about to begin. He also needed to prepare to go on stage. Beforehand, Laurent had to put on a specially designed robe, though he wasn't sure what it all meant. Losung poured Laurent a cup of tea, a specially prepared drink meant to help him relax. Laurent trusted Losung and took the cup, drinking it down. 13 years into the apocalypse, a prophecy circulated among the survivors, a boy born from the belly of a zombie, naturally immune to the zombie virus, who would one day grow up to save all of humanity. Of course, those who had survived this long were no fools. To verify the prophecy's authenticity, the followers held a ceremony at the monastery.
The time has come. From across France, from Germany, from Spain, you've come as pilgrims to be part of this community out of a shared belief, a faith in what is yet to come.
Losung gave a brief opening speech, then turned and signaled toward the backstage. At once, Jacinta entered with a squad of people. At the same time, Daryl and his team had scaled the wall and blended into the crowd of followers, waiting for the right moment. The onlookers speculated that the young boy at the end of the procession must be the prophesied savior. As the atmosphere grew more charged, Losung addressed the followers once more. He spoke of how the development of Union of Hope had not come easily. Many had doubts about the savior's authenticity, and this ceremony was meant to prove that the savior of prophecy was indeed real. This child, immune to zombie bites, would lead them to create a future resistant to the zombie virus. At that moment, a cloaked figure stepped forward. Losung walked up to introduce the figure.
So who better to confirm our faith in Laurent than someone we've just lost but who loved him dearly? And now, Her love will deliver us all.
Isabelle was also shocked. In just one day, Sylvie had been turned into a zombie and used to test Laurent. The soldier pushed Sylvie forward, and tension rose among everyone around. Yet, facing the zombies directly, Laurent remained unusually calm. Isabelle frantically scanned the distance, finally spotting Daryl within the crowd. But Daryl tried to aim at Laurent, but a flag blocked his view. Upon hearing the sound of a gun cocking, Daryl quickly turned and fired an arrow. Seeing that Daryl was blocked by the crowd, Laurent rushed up in a rage. Isabelle and Fallu seized the moment to shield Laurent. The scene was pure chaos as everyone began fleeing, and Isabelle and Fallu blended into the crowd. Escaping with Laurent, Laurent ordered his men to pursue and kill Daryl, but Daryl had no intention of sticking around and bolted away immediately. 5 minutes later, Daryl managed to meet up with Isabelle and the others at an intersection, and they began making their way toward the outskirts of the city. Laurent seemed a bit off, clearly affected by some strange substance he had ingested. At Isabelle's repeated urging, Laurent managed to keep pace with the group. Ahead, guards were stationed at an intersection. Daryl and Fallu exchanged a knowing look, each swiftly taking out a guard before pressing forward. They ducked into a woodshed along the way, just narrowly avoiding the pursuing soldiers' line of sight. Daryl hurriedly moved a wooden plank over to block the doorway. After waiting until the pursuers had gone far away, Daryl seized the moment to plan their next move.
I need your help. I need you to take him to our secret place. Okay? The place that we train. The cave in the woods. The cave in the woods, you remember? Listen to me.
Seeing that Laurent was finally responding, Daryl quickly repeated what he had just said, trying to stir Laurent's memory. After a long moment, Laurent finally came back to his senses.
The one by the big rocks?
Yeah.
Fallu and Isabelle both understood that this approach was a last resort, but they had no choice but to follow Daryl's plan and trust him to handle everything. After confirming that it was temporarily safe outside, Daryl called everyone to move, but when he turned around, he saw someone coming down the staircase ahead. So, Daryl simply stepped forward, preparing to face them head-on. Meanwhile, Isabelle, Fallu, and Laurent were making their way down along the castle wall, with Fallu leading the way. Unexpectedly, a guard was stationed directly above them, but they had to pass through here no matter what, so they could only take the risk of quietly slipping along the base of the wall. While the guard was turned, scanning the outside of the castle, Fallu dashed across to the other side, narrowly avoiding detection. However, when he got over, he realized that there was another guard directly above his previous position. Seizing the moment, he signaled Isabelle and Laurent to follow. Isabelle quickly pulled Laurent aside, whispered a few instructions, then urged him to go first. Laurent edged along the wall, successfully reaching cover behind a crate. Isabelle was about to move as well, but after only a few steps, she heard someone approaching. She had no choice but to press against the wall and back up. Luckily, there was a wooden door ahead, and she slipped inside. Meanwhile, Daryl was locked in combat, using the narrow hallway to swiftly take down two men. One tried to flee, but Daryl tripped him up, sending him sprawling to the ground. With no room to use his bow, Daryl grabbed the man by the throat, subduing him quickly, then took the quiver off his back and tossed it onto the man's body. Daryl walked the entire way out along the passage, staying vigilant with a dagger in his hand. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the stairwell. He picked up the dagger and began running back, but the sound of pursuers grew closer, forcing him to turn and face them. He struck the first attacker with his only dagger, and in the blink of an eye, another pursuer came. The soldier was tall and muscular, leaving Daryl momentarily at a loss. More soldiers arrived, and Daryl had to use his opponent as a shield to fend off the attacks. After dispatching the last pursuer, Daryl stood up, yanked a harpoon from the fallen soldier, and prepared to run before any more reinforcements arrived. But unfortunately, someone else rushed up to die. Daryl quickly tipped over a nearby shelf, then spun around and charged at the person behind him. Before his opponent could get up, he drove the harpoon straight into him, then grabbed an iron plow hanging from the ceiling beam. The fight had taken its toll on Daryl. He was exhausted. He pulled his dagger out of one person and then walked towards the stairs. But as soon as he stepped out the door, he encountered another soldier. Daryl swiftly took care of him. Daryl bypassed the stairs ahead, leaping onto a lower rooftop with the intent of slipping into the alleys of the residential area, but as he stood up, he saw that more pursuers were already blocking his path. Assessing the situation, Daryl cursed under his breath, realizing he had no choice but to surrender. On the other side, Isabelle was still hiding behind the small door, with guards on both sides of the path. She could only observe the outside through a crack. Fallow had also been waiting across from her for a long time. Seizing a moment when the guards were distracted, he gave Isabelle a small nod and quietly led Laurent away. 2 hours later, a bruised and bloody Daryl was dragged into a cell by the guards. Lo-Sung interrogated Daryl, but Daryl remained tight-lipped about Laurent's whereabouts, leaving them no choice but to lock him up for the time being. The guards, confident that Daryl couldn't escape, casually left the keys on a nearby table. Daryl dropped his arms in defeat, his body aching all over, completely sapped of strength. Escape seemed impossible. Meanwhile, Fallow returned to the mountain cave, where he informed Laurent that he had waited outside for a long time, but no one had shown up. Laurent was filled with guilt, feeling that he had brought misfortune upon Isabelle, Daryl, and even his sister Sylvie, who had raised him. All these tragedies stemmed from the prophecy about him, and he had even felt pride in it, simply because everyone treated him as someone special. Hearing Laurent's words, Fallow sprang up and cursed Lo-Sung as a despicable bastard. He then told Laurent, "None of this is your fault. It was because everyone believed the rumors that they lost their judgment and followed his orders."
Pas Daryl. Il y a jamais cru, lui.
Will Daryl manage to escape? And will Lo-Sung capture Laurent once again? Stay tuned for more exciting events in the next episode. In the previous episode, Carol and Ash's plane was forced to land in Greenland, where they encountered Un and Hannah, but Un threatened Ash, demanding he become her lover, while Carol convinced Hannah to help them escape. Hannah killed Un, but was then killed by Ash. Ash and Carol fled Greenland under the cover of night. Even though they had a silent agreement not to mention the two women on the island, the memories still weighed heavily on their minds, especially for Ash, who couldn't bring himself to stop and rest for a moment. By the following day, they had already reached the skies over France. Carol looked down in surprise as they continued to fly along a river, with a large city visible in the distance.
What about that? Right over there? Looks like a racetrack, maybe?
Yeah. Good eye. All right, hold on.
Without a word, Ash adjusted the flight path, steering the plane toward the runway below. Soon, they were descending rapidly, landing smoothly on the runway and coming to a gradual stop. Carol pushed open the cabin door and slowly rose to step outside. For over a decade in the apocalypse, Carol had survived with Rick's group, fighting for a safe and stable shelter. She'd never imagined that one day she'd risk crossing the ocean to this foreign country. It wasn't until she set foot on this land that everything around her started to feel real. Half an hour later, Ash dragged the plane over toward the stables, planning to hide it so no one would tamper with it after they left. Carol thought about it for a long time and suggested to Ash that it might be better if he stayed here.
I don't want anything to happen to the plane.
It won't. I'll hide it.
Or to you. I don't want you getting hurt because of me. I'm responsible for you.
No, I am responsible for me. I made the decision to come here because I want to help you, okay? So, well, let me help you find your daughter.
Carol fell silent instantly. Her supposed mission to find her daughter was actually a lie. Yet Ash had still helped her without hesitation. The road ahead would surely be full of danger, and in all fairness, she shouldn't let Ash continue risking himself for her. Ash was confused. If there was danger, shouldn't they stick together? Why would she insist he stay behind? Seeing this, Carol tried a different approach to persuade him. She told Ash that the plane was their only way out. Protecting the plane is crucial, and this place seems relatively safe. She was confident he had the skills to survive here for a while. Ash agreed, realizing that in a foreign land after the apocalypse, finding someone was like looking for a needle in a haystack. It was better to prepare for a long journey ahead.
We'll need fuel. How long are you gonna be?
Not very long, I hope. If I'm not back in 2 weeks, don't keep waiting.
I'm not leaving without you.
Carol felt deeply moved. Ash's kindness always exceeded her expectations, so she made a solemn promise to him that she would return to this place. She then handed Daryl's crossbow to Ash, urging him to protect himself, and slung her rifle over her shoulder as she prepared to leave. Carol was relying solely on her determination to find Daryl. She had no clear destination or route and could only head toward the city, knowing that densely populated areas might have survivors who could offer more information. 2 hours later, Carol stopped in a square, where she could see the entirety of Paris, including the Arc de Triomphe and the Eiffel Tower in the distance. Unlike Daryl's rough journey through Paris, Carol knew nothing about the state of the apocalypse here. She could only wander the streets, hoping for a stroke of luck. Just then, an advertisement board caught her attention. Several identical posters were plastered on it, appearing to mark the symbol of a local gang. Suddenly, the roar of an engine sounded behind her, and Carol quickly ducked behind an abandoned car. A military truck soon rolled past her, and Carol shifted position, carefully staying out of sight. Unexpectedly, the military truck still stopped not far away. Carol quickly ducked and hid in the side compartment. 2 soldiers soon jumped out, grabbing a homeless man off the ground and slamming him against the wall. Carol hid across from them, silently observing and hesitating about whether or not to intervene and help the man. But before Carol could react, the soldiers started dragging the homeless man toward the truck. Seeing that they hadn't noticed her, Carol quickly darted behind the truck and swiped some food, only to notice that the bags had a logo identical to the one on the posters she'd seen earlier. Just then, a soldier up ahead heard a noise coming from the back of the truck and jogged over to check, but he didn't find anything unusual. Carol had already returned to her original hiding spot. After the soldier dismissed his doubts, he returned to the driver's seat and continued down the road with the truck full of supplies. None of them noticed that one of the food bags had a tear at the bottom, with grains slowly spilling out along the way. The hole in the grain bag, of course, had been cut by Carol. The truck loaded with supplies was clearly heading toward a community or camp. It was just that the soldiers were not very friendly, so she didn't want to approach them. Thus, she used this method to guide herself, helping her find where people were gathering. But when she reached a fork in the road, the trail of grain had disappeared. Carol hesitated, wondering which direction to take, when she heard faint noises and the murmur of a crowd from up ahead. At the corner, she spotted a large group of people gathering toward a small square. Carol also put away her rifle and pretended to be an ordinary resident as she walked over. At the entrance to the square, several soldiers stood guard, collecting weapons from everyone who entered and conducting full-body searches. Facing this unfamiliar group in a foreign place, Carol was understandably nervous, but her experience allowed her to slip into the crowd with ease. She saw the soldiers carrying boxes of supplies and lining them up in the open space in front of them. Carol hadn't yet figured out what was happening when, with a single command from a soldier, the entire crowd surged forward, each person frantically grabbing food to fill their baskets. Watching the chaotic crowd, Carol realized that this army had done this before, yet she'd also seen soldiers beating a homeless man earlier. Maybe things weren't as straightforward as they seemed. Sure enough, a female officer suddenly shouted for everyone to stop, and the crowd looked toward her in confusion.
C'est un petit aperçu de ce que la maison mère peut vous offrir. Des repas chauds, un lit douillet, de l'eau, du vin, des plaisirs simples tous les jours, mais uniquement si vous acceptez de soutenir Madame Genet. Alors, les volontaires? Tournez-vous. J'en veux 20.
The officer's voice barely faded before the residents started rushing forward again. Carol instinctively backed away, wanting to leave the area. She didn't understand what the female officer was saying, but she could guess that they were planning to take some people away. Suddenly, after the gunshot, everyone fell silent, obediently raising their hands and waiting for the soldiers to make their selections. In that moment, Carol understood the truth. The free supplies were just a ruse. This army's real goal was to pick out specific people. She turned and lunged for the back of the truck, hoping to find something to use as a weapon. Suddenly, a soldier behind Carol suddenly grabbed her shoulder, then pushed her toward the back of the truck, forcing her to sit in the very back according to the order. Behind her, 2 elderly men tried to get on the same truck, but the soldiers split them up without a second thought. Carol was forced to climb onto the truck, and the selected people sat down one after another. Not long after, the convoy set off, but Carol had no idea where they were being taken. At this moment, all she could do was go with the flow. Hours passed, and night fell, but the convoy still hadn't reached its destination. When a stranger tried to make friendly conversation, Carol merely offered a polite smile in return. After a while, she asked the man next to her where the convoy was actually going.
You've heard of Madame Genet? No. She's trying to start over. In New France, I was skeptical, but it's hard to argue with bread.
Remy started talking about survival, mentioning his traveling companion. A man named Julian, his husband, who was put in one of the trucks behind them. Originally, they had been struggling to survive, moving from place to place in the apocalypse. But when Julian developed a lung condition, they heard that Genet had doctors under her command. So they attended the gathering and were selected. Carol felt sympathy for their situation but shared nothing about her own past. After all, in the apocalypse, you couldn't afford to show your vulnerabilities. About 10 minutes later, the convoy passed through a gate, entering a castle, but Remy noticed something was wrong. Under the threat of the soldiers, Remy had no choice but to sit back. Carol also sensed the danger, but there was nothing she could do now. For the time being, she could only resign herself to whatever was about to unfold. Half an hour later, Sabine entered the interrogation room to report the number of volunteers to Genet. Then, she glanced at the tortured prisoner and pleaded with Genet to show mercy, but Genet refused without hesitation. A traitor couldn't be treated with kindness. She was determined to extract the location of the Union of Hope's headquarters. After Sabine left, Genet turned to the prisoner and said, "I once had high hopes for you, even wanted you to replace Sabine as my right hand, yet you chose betrayal. You even deceived me for the sake of those foolish believers. However, I have plenty of patience for dealing with someone as stubborn as you."
L'information dont j'ai besoin, elle est à l'intérieur de toi. Et ils vont finir par sortir. La nonne, l'enfant, l'Américain.
No sooner had Genet finished speaking than Cadron, bound to the chair, let out another agonized scream. Cadron had endured scenes like this countless times before. Although he was a brutal man himself, he had never once regretted helping Daryl escape. Before the apocalypse, the painting of the Mona Lisa still hung in the Louvre, drawing tens of thousands of visitors every day. Tour guides delivered passionate explanations while nearby children played on their gaming devices. 13 years ago, Genet was just a janitor, constantly put down by her female supervisor and forced to swallow her pride while cleaning up everyone else's messes. A female colleague nearby felt indignant on Genet's behalf, but Genet said she didn't want to make a fuss about it. Seeing this, the colleague changed the subject and reminded her to be sure to attend the meeting during their lunch break. Genet really couldn't refuse, so she had to agree to the other person's invitation, and then continued to clean up the traces on the floor. Half an hour later, the lower-level employees of the museum gathered in the hallway. Officially, it was a meeting, but in reality, they were discussing a plan to stage a collective strike on Saturday morning. They intended to hand out flyers to inform the visitors of their reasons. When Genet heard this, she couldn't help but laugh.
Mais non, mais c'est vrai. On sera aux infos pendant quelques jours, ensuite le gouvernement continuera de nous baiser comme d'hab.
It was obvious that none of Genet's colleagues agreed. This was a protest organized by the trade union, and workers had to stand together. Genet nodded indifferently. Suddenly, all their phones rang at the same time. 2 hours later, chaos had engulfed the museum. Many people were inexplicably trapped here, with their phones as their only means of contacting the outside world. Genet's husband had come to pick her up from work, but every exit was blocked. All he could do was share what he'd heard. Something major was happening outside, with the military evacuating the area and advising residents to go home and lock their doors. Since explaining over the phone was difficult, they arranged to meet at the nearest entrance. Talking on the phone as she walked, Genet was nearing the door when a guard stopped her. She quickly pointed to her husband outside, saying it was her husband, but the guards were rough and wouldn't allow her to get close, even using force to push her back. Genet was taken aback for a moment, but quickly gestured for her husband to meet her at the opposite side. He ran over, following her instructions. At the same time, people in the square were also running, as if something terrifying had appeared. The guards were frantically trying to keep order, but the noise was so overwhelming that no other sounds could be heard. Through the glass, Genet and her husband looked into each other's eyes with the intensity of lovers separated by a world. Just then, Genet's face suddenly changed. Her husband instinctively turned to look. As he was brutally killed right before her eyes, Genet's world collapsed. She couldn't understand how a perfectly ordinary day had turned into a nightmare. She screamed until her voice was hoarse, but the monsters outside didn't heed her cries, cruelly tearing her husband to pieces. Half an hour later, Genet stumbled back into the gallery. During the day, the place was packed with people, but now she was all alone. On the wall, the Mona Lisa still smiled, while Genet's eyes filled with tears and her heart was shattered. Seeing the painting again, Genet suddenly realized something. Recalling everything that had happened today, she began to laugh and cry. unable to calm herself for a long time. In the end, Genet made a decision to rebuild order in the apocalypse and establish a new France. Back to the present, the painting was still well preserved, though it now hung in a dilapidated little room. Standing opposite it, admiring the piece, was none other than the newcomer, Carol. Genet, unexpectedly finding someone who could appreciate the painting, began to chat with Carol, and then she gave her a closer look, asking where Carol was from. Carol thought for a moment and replied, "I came from the east side of Paris. 13 years ago, I was visiting as a tourist, but then the apocalypse hit, and I couldn't go back." Genet nodded thoughtfully and continued discussing their previous topic. Just then, a large man behind them cursed, complaining that the food was terrible. Before shoving his plate onto the floor, Genet looked at the scene expressionlessly.
Je vais chercher une serpillière. Non.
As soon as Genet finished speaking, everyone looked over, although most of them had never seen Genet before. Her presence still instantly commanded the attention of the entire room. Genet walked forward slowly, saying in a calm voice,
Tu comprends que la nourriture est un bien précieux.
Oui, madame.
Alors ça ne te dérangera pas de manger à même le sol.
The large man was one of Genet's soldiers, and he knew full well that orders couldn't be disobeyed. But in front of all these people, his pride held him back from immediately complying. After a long moment of silence, the man finally lowered his head and admitted his mistake. He pushed his chair aside, knelt on the floor, and began eating the food off the ground. No one here dared to defy Genet's orders, knowing the consequences were far worse than death. After dealing with the troublemaker, Genet received grateful glances from the kitchen staff.
Bon appétit!
Excuse the interruption. I have no tolerance for bullies. Marion Genet, welcome to the Maison Mère.
Carol was startled. So, this woman was the most powerful leader in France right now. However, Genet was obviously not simple, and it would take some time to observe whether he was an enemy or a friend. The next day, the base was bustling with activity. Carol and Remy joined the line by the window, waiting for assignments from the staff inside. The worker glanced up and saw that they were both older, so he assigned them to the kitchen and the stables before urging them to hurry on. Carol couldn't understand the language here, but luckily Remy pulled her along and explained as they continued walking. They chatted as they headed toward the courtyard, passing a group of soldiers loading weapons. Remy continued explaining to Carol that these soldiers were being sent to attack a Union of Hope outpost. Since that organization had been opposing Genet, Genet was determined to locate their headquarters and eliminate the threat once and for all. Just then, they saw a line of people up ahead, handcuffed and being escorted somewhere. Sensing something unusual, they decided to follow quietly. The soldiers marched the prisoners through a corridor to the forest outside the base, where an iron door stood guarded by two people in white lab coats. Under the soldiers' threats, they stood against the stone wall. Carol and Remy hid behind the iron plate and watched the scene in front of them without daring to make a sound. One of the white-coated individuals picked up a syringe, injected it into a man's neck, and reminded their assistant to record the data. Gunfire erupted from behind the stone wall again apparently. This was another batch of test subjects. Remy whispered to Carol, explaining that rumors had it Genet's people were conducting biochemical experiments to create different types of violent zombies. The corroded zombies outside were the result of an accidental spread. Before he could finish speaking, the recently dead prisoners began convulsing violently and, in the next second, suddenly sprang up only to be shot down by the soldiers. It turned out Genet was attempting to create powerful, controllable zombies to fight in place of her army. Carol could only think that these people were all mad, and she grew even more worried that Daryl might have been captured as well. At that moment,
Dégagez! À moins que vous soyez volontaire pour être cobaye.
Sorry. On y va, on y va.
Carol and Remy, still shaken, began to walk back. They decided to gather intelligence around the base immediately. Remy wanted to go with Carol to search for his husband, but Carol felt it would draw too much attention. She urged Remy to return for now, and she'd find a way to contact him once she had any information. So they parted ways. Carol went to a residential area, hiding in a secluded corner to observe. At the entrance ahead, soldiers stood guard. She'd need to find a way to slip in. Just then, she saw a group from the kitchen delivering food and quickly approached to offer her help. Just as Carol finished complaining, a guard flicked his cigarette butt into the pot before finally allowing them to pass through. The kitchen staff barely reacted, they were used to it. They simply removed the filthy items from the bucket, entered the room, and placed the food on the tables as if nothing had happened. Carol attracted no suspicion, and as food was distributed, She took the opportunity to ask around. She approached an injured man and urgently asked if he knew Daryl. Cadron replied, "I tried everything I could to capture Daryl, but in the end, I let him go and this hand is the price I paid." Carol immediately sensed that this was not a good situation. She quickly pressed Cadron for Daryl's location. There was no way Cadron would tell Carol so easily. He had been tortured to keep this secret.
There's a reason I found you. There has to be. It's a sign. Daryl Dixon. He's my brother.
Cadron froze for a moment, tilting his head slightly to continue listening. Carol was just about to explain further when a chef behind her shouted at her to hurry. She was now extremely anxious. If she missed this chance, she might never get another.
Please help me. I have come a very long way. He's the only family I have left.
On sera tous punis si on n'y va pas.
Looking at Carol's pleading eyes, Cadron hesitated for a long time before he relented. He told her, "There's a small island near the beaches of Normandy. Daryl's in the castle there." Carol took a moment to absorb this before following the chef outside. When she looked back, Cadron had already closed his eyes, as if accepting his fate and waiting for death. Returning to her quarters, Carol quickly found Remy for help. After a bit of deduction, Remy realized she was likely talking about Mont Saint-Michel. It would take only a few hours to drive there. Carol invited Remy to come with her, but he refused without hesitation. His husband needed the doctors here. Carol nodded, understanding, and reluctantly bid farewell to Remy. In just 2 days, they'd gone from strangers to close friends. Because they shared one thing in common, their loved ones meant everything to them. So, can Carol manage to escape and make it to Mont Saint-Michel to find Daryl? Tune in for the next exciting episode.
Daryl Dixon. He's my brother. Do you know where he is now?
There's an island fortress on the Normandy coast.
Allez, viens.
Hurry up.
In the previous episode, Carol finally got word on Daryl's whereabouts, and at the same time, she realized she was deep within enemy territory. She must find Nest before Genet does if she's to have any chance of rescuing Daryl. 10 minutes later, Carol seized her chance, knocked out the guard, and carefully set down the wrench. She then took the gun from the unconscious guard. Now, all she needed was a vehicle to make a quick escape from this place. However, the cars next to her were all locked, and she couldn't find the car keys for a while. Just then, Carol saw a few warhorses not far away, and she was slightly relieved. This was undoubtedly a convenient means of transportation. The approach of strangers made the horses a little frightened, and Carol could only find a way to calm them down first. Carol took a nervous step back, afraid the horses' neighing might alert nearby soldiers. Luckily, the horse quickly calmed down. She hurriedly secured the gun onto the horse's back, then moved to the front to untie the rope, and with one swift motion, swung herself up onto the saddle. She looked around nervously and just happened to notice that the guard on the ground had woken up. This was bad. Carol spurred the horse forward, racing towards the gate. Before long, the guard would raise the alarm and soldiers would come after her. If she acted fast, she had just enough time to escape, but Carol pulled on the reins and quickly analyzed the situation before her. These soldiers were clearly lying in wait, as if they knew someone would show up. Carol realized that she had been betrayed. Sabine watched her with a smug smile. It seemed Carol was in real trouble this time. In his office, Remy closed his eyes in shame as he heard the door open behind him. Carol walked in, unsurprised to see it was Remy who had betrayed her. Genet watched Carol intently, curious to see how she would react to this betrayal by a friend. But to her surprise, Carol remained calm, as though nothing had happened. Disappointment was evident on Carol's face.
This is the only way we could think of to save Julien. I'm sure you would have done the same for your Daryl, no?
She could understand Remy's desperation to save his husband, but she could never forgive his betrayal. Genet broke the silence, stating that she would arrange treatment for Julien's lung disease and provide a stable home in Paris for Remy and Julien. For Remy and Julien, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Though they sacrificed a friend, their future was now secure. Carol stayed silent, observing carefully, knowing that the real mastermind hadn't yet revealed her true intentions. As if reading Carol's thoughts, Genet said with her back turned,
"There are 2 guerriers right outside. Might as well sit down."
The warning in Genet's words was unmistakable, so Carol had no choice but to comply. Moving to sit at the table, Genet slowly poured 2 glasses of red wine, then walked over to the table, set them down, and sat beside Carol. Carol was momentarily uncertain of Genet's intentions. From her prior observations, she knew that traitors were always harshly punished.
Or I can have you signed to the atelier. I believe you have witnessed some of her research tests.
Carol was taken aback. If Genet had seen through her and still let her live, it could only mean that Genet thought she still had some use. So, Carol continued the conversation along that line. To her surprise, Genet candidly revealed that the lab was developing a drug aimed at controlling zombies for combat, a strategy to reduce soldier casualties and aid in world peace. Carol nodded in understanding. So this was the real purpose behind the zombie army project, using force to counter force. Seeing how quickly Carol understood, Genet decided to be direct, instructing Carol to honestly explain how she ended up here. Carol felt a hint of frustration. She had never encountered an opponent who matched her so evenly.
I landed 2 days ago from America.
Really?
I manipulated an innocent man into letting me fly in his plane under the false pretense of looking for my daughter. We had to stop in Greenland, where he was almost used as a sperm donor, and I was nearly murdered by insane environmentalists.
Carol turned her head away. She had expected that anyone hearing such an outlandish story would react just like this. Genet continued her questioning.
And why do you want to find Dixon?
I came here to kill him.
Must have done something terrible to you.
Carol gave no answer, which was as good as admitting to it. This made Genet unexpectedly self-conscious, and she even offered Carol a few words of encouragement, saying that persistence would eventually bring its rewards. Seeing Genet's sudden shift in attitude, Carol responded,
"You can't imagine what I have done to get this far."
I understand, I do.
Carol put on an expression of empathy, knowing this would likely elicit sympathy from her counterpart. But Genet seemed unfazed by this, and instead urged Carol to pull herself together, to turn her past hardships into motivation. Seeing that Genet's reaction was not at all what she expected, Carol raised her glass, saying she'd give it a try. Genet played along, taking a sip of wine before standing up and speaking.
I believe you've helped us locate their headquarters. The island fortress in Normandy that my former comrade told you about. I'll organize a convoy in the morning. You want to kill Dixon yourself? I will take you to him.
Carol's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected Genet to be this astute. She couldn't help but worry about how much of her half-truths Genet had managed to piece together. The next day, Genet didn't hurry to set off. Instead, she directed the convoy to detour near the Louvre and stopped there once again. She had intentionally brought Carol here to revisit their first conversation about the famous paintings housed within the Louvre. Genet had originally been just an ordinary cleaner, spending her nights alone tidying the galleries, with only the paintings on the walls as her companions. Initially, she couldn't understand why artists always seemed to create works centered on images of death or suffering. It wasn't until the arrival of the zombies, when she and others narrowly survived but were trapped in the museum for a week, that she gradually began to understand the meaning within those paintings. After facing so many trials of human nature, all those apocalyptic scenes were emphasizing the chaos and destruction brought on by humanity itself, while imagining an all-powerful force that could save people from catastrophe. But reality, she realized, was often harsh. Prayers alone could not bring change. Humans had to stand up and clean up the mess themselves. Carol understood Genet's point. Under such circumstances, someone indeed had to step forward to help people regain hope, so that order could eventually be restored. But the post-apocalyptic world also required new adaptive rules, and former religious doctrines were impractical, more likely to become tools for those with ulterior motives to control the masses. Genet smiled, pleased, indicating her approval. She knew Carol would understand her perspective. Carol made no comment, knowing that in a world like this, everyone held their own survival beliefs. She had seen plenty of people with such extreme views and could only acknowledge that, while the intentions were good, the methods were far too radical. Back in the present, the sound of the prison door opening and nest broke the silence, and Daryl was crushed to see who had entered. Isabelle had also been captured, and she appeared badly injured. Daryl was eager to ask what had happened, but Isabelle simply told him not to worry before being dragged into the adjacent cell next to him. The guard escorting Isabelle takes a chain and shackles her to the water pipe as well. Once the guard had left, Daryl asked Isabelle what had happened. Isabelle explained that they had split up during their escape attempt. Fallow and Laurent found an opportunity to escape, but she was forced to hide in the passage beneath the city wall and was soon caught by a patrol. At that moment, Isabelle caught sight of a cockroach scuttling out from a drain. she slowly extended her foot, managing to pry up the drain cover and held it in her hand, keeping it ready for later use. Daryl leaned against the cold wall, advising Isabelle to conserve her strength, saying they would escape tomorrow, but neither of them could sleep, knowing that Nest would not let them off easily and that tomorrow would surely bring another brutal fight.
Tell me a story.
About what?
Just want to hear your voice.
We can do whatever you want. We sleep late, take long walks, watch the sun go down by the river.
That sounds like a dream.
Daryl nodded and continued to imagine their future lives. Isabelle struggled to move over to the wall and reached her hand out toward Daryl in the adjacent cell. Daryl quickly took it, despite the wall between them. In this moment, their hearts were closer than ever. What this ill-fated couple didn't know was that tonight was bound to be a sleepless night. Meanwhile, 2 kilometers away along the beach, a convoy rumbled forward, heading for the castle. Carol felt a wave of anxiety. She was close to finding Daryl, but Genet seemed to be growing suspicious of her and might very well force her and Daryl into a deadly showdown. She had to come up with a plan before she was completely cornered. 10 minutes later, the convoy came to a halt 500 meters from the castle. Genet thought this distance ideal for pre-battle preparations, but Sabine worried that rushing in might undermine the element of surprise they hoped to achieve. Genet, however, firmly countered, saying that war is always sudden, and they only needed to make sure their warriors were ready for action. Carol looked ahead and saw a crowd disembarking from the convoy's rear. From their attire, they appeared to be ordinary civilians. Meanwhile, on Genet's side, she was shaking hands one by one with her fully armed soldiers. Something didn't feel quite right. Meanwhile, Laurent entered the prison with 2 guards. He wasn't about to give Daryl and Isabelle a chance to recover and planned to interrogate Isabelle again. Isabelle responded with silence. Seeing her unyielding attitude, Laurent thought for a moment, then ordered his men to take Isabelle away. Daryl's anxiety mounted, fearing they intended to torture Isabelle again, and he shouted, demanding to know where they were taking her. Without turning, Laurent coldly replied that Isabelle would eventually see reason.
Isabelle has always had an open mind and heart. You sadly are beyond hope.
Daryl was confident that Isabelle would never choose betrayal, but he still wanted to divert Laurent's attention in hopes of at least easing some of the pressure on Isabelle. At the same time, outside the castle on the tidal flats, Genet's forces were gathering in full. Standing at the center, she gave a loud speech, praising everyone present as fearless warriors, offering her deepest gratitude and respect. Carol couldn't understand the speech, so she stayed alert, scanning her surroundings. Just then, she spotted Dr. Lafleur preparing a concoction nearby and instantly realized Genet's plan. However, the other civilians hadn't noticed anything unusual. They simply thought this was a risky battle. They firmly believed that, no matter the outcome, their sacrifice would secure a better future, so they trusted Genet's words without question. By this time, Dr. Lafleur had prepared a specialized weapon. Seeing this, Carol stepped out from the crowd, unable to stand by while these innocent people met a tragic fate. Carol was shoved back into the crowd by 2 soldiers, and in that moment, she realized that Genet hadn't regarded her any differently. Genet had only created an illusion of equality, making Carol mistakenly believe she might survive until the end. Nearby, a group of soldiers pushed a cannon into position, likely preparing to clear the path for those following behind. Sensing danger, Carol hid behind a large man. At Genet's command, the tarp on the truck ahead was thrown open, revealing a machine gun aimed directly at them, and suddenly, the soldiers turned against the civilians. In an instant, panic swept through the crowd. They couldn't understand why Genet would do this, but defenseless, they had no way to resist. Seconds later, everyone lay on the ground, but Carol had anticipated this and immediately followed the large man down. The gunfire ceased, and Dr. Lafleur quickly instructed the soldiers to move forward. They had to inject every body with a strengthening serum before they turned into zombies.
Hey, regarde. Vas-y, sûr. Ouais, d'accord.
Carol quietly reached for the needle, and with the smallest movement, she pulled it out. The serum would have injected automatically. She was skirting the very edge of death in a desperate bid for survival. Soon, all the bodies had been injected, and Dr. Lafleur's team retreated. the soldiers all raised their machine guns, staying on high alert as they expanded the perimeter. They had all witnessed the deadly power of the rabid zombies firsthand. Just then, an all-terrain vehicle approached from the rear, with a man tied to its frame. Genet, satisfied with her strategy, knew there was no one better suited to serve as bait than Cadron. This was her method of punishing traitors. Carol observed everything unfolding in front of her, stunned to see that even this man had met such an end. Cadron understood his fate as well, and he accepted it with a calm resignation. Suddenly, the bodies around Carol began to convulse, transforming into rabid zombies under the serum's influence, and she dared not move a muscle, forced to watch helplessly as it all unfolded. Struggling against the all-terrain vehicle's frame, Cadron wasn't afraid of death. He was furious at such a humiliating way to die. Just as Carol was about to get up and blend into the zombie horde, a few zombies in front suddenly turned toward her. She had still been discovered by the zombies. Without a second thought, Carol broke into a sprint, narrowly dodging their attacks.
Get us out of here!
Carol quickly dashed to the ATV, then hit the accelerator and sped off. With hordes of zombies roaring as they chased after her, Cadron had survived by sheer luck, but he still felt a chill run down his spine. With the horde so close behind, his life was entirely in Carol's hands. Unfamiliar with the area, Carol had no choice but to follow the single road leading toward the castle. The road wasn't long, but for Carol and Cadron on the all-terrain vehicle, every second felt like torture. Ahead was Nest's gate, but it was obvious they wouldn't be let in. Carol glanced back, seeing the zombies closing in fast. Instinctively, she sped up, but just as they neared the gate, she abruptly slammed on the brakes.
What are you doing? Why are you stopping? They're coming! They're coming!
Carol wasn't waiting for death, but rather waiting for Genet's elite squad to act. They would only fire the cannon when the zombies reached the castle gate, clearing the path for the convoy. Shielding herself from the blast's impact, Carol looked back and saw the zombies mere feet away. Cadron, terrified, shouted for her to speed up, and she slammed on the gas, racing toward the gate. Previously, Carol pretended she intended to kill Daryl, and Genet agreed to cooperate with her. Near Nest, Genet prepared to kill a group of people, including Carol, turning them into weapons to attack Nest. Carol, along with Cadron, escaped toward Nest on an ATV. To clear the path for the zombies, Genet's elite team launched a shell that hit the castle gate with precise accuracy. Carol just recovered when she realized that the zombies were already close at hand. At Codron's loud urging, she slammed on the gas and charged straight out. The guards blocked in front of the ATV and shot to stop it, but Carol still accelerated forward. What the guards didn't know was that there were hundreds of rabid zombies just outside the gate. By the time they heard the commotion, it was already too late. They were instantly knocked to the ground by the zombies, while the guards farther away began to flee. Those pinned beneath the zombies could only despair as they were torn apart. As the last wave of zombies charged through the gate, Genet's army also arrived on the battlefield. Carol drove the ATV in constant zigzags, dodging obstacles. At the end of the path, another guard tried to block her, but she slammed on the brakes, knocking him to the ground. As the ATV came to a stop, Cadron shouted, urging her to release his restraints. At that moment, several rabid zombies charged toward them. Carol grabbed a weapon, firing a shot at the approaching zombies before turning to tell Cadron to stay still. Then she raised an axe and swung it at the chains holding him, but another guard approached from nearby, shouting at them to drop their weapons. Carol and Cadron were unsure what to do when, suddenly,
Go up the mountain.
What about you?
Tell Dixon I did it for the boy.
Cadron finished speaking and then turned and charged forward. Carol had saved his life, and he wanted to buy her some time. If he could hold back this wave of zombies, it would spare them a lot of chaos and trouble. Meanwhile, Isabelle was brought into the interrogation room. At Lo Zhang's signal, the guard untied Isabelle. Isabelle knew torture awaited her, but she still firmly refused to comply. Lo Zhang was not angry. He led Isabelle in recalling Laurent's past, explaining that Nest had chosen Laurent as the savior solely because of his mysterious origins and his uncanny ability to understand people's hearts. They used prophecy to spread his story and grow the Union of Hope. A year ago, when the time was right, they intended to call Laurent back, using the savior's influence to stabilize the situation, rallying all followers to unite against Genet. Upon hearing the truth, Isabelle felt a sense of relief. These people were hypocrites, exploiting faith to manipulate the masses, when in reality they were only after power and control.
It's not strength, Lausanne. It's desperate, misguided, and it's savage.
Sounds like Daryl talking.
No, it's me.
You yourself said how special the boy was all those years ago.
He's special. He thinks and feels in a way that humanity needs in order to survive. But he's human. He can bleed, he can be hurt, he can die. Like Jesus, like Muhammad, like Buddha.
This is a waste of time.
Arrête!
Standing up, Lo Sung continued, all we need to do is prove this faith. Isabelle instantly understood. This group had calculated everything, whether or not Laurent is immune to the zombie virus. As long as the verification ritual proceeds smoothly, it will be a done deal in their favor. Suddenly,
Attention au portail. Ils sont dans la montée.
Lo Sung wiped a bit of blood from his face, then casually picked up a dagger from the table and plunged it into Isabelle's body. Seeing Lo Sung in a stunned daze, Jacinta quickly stepped forward, pulling him back and reminding him that they had more urgent matters. They must leave immediately. No one confirmed whether Isabelle was dead or alive. She was simply left there on the spot. Elsewhere, Carol made her way into a narrow alley in the residential area. As she reached the corner, she saw a family fleeing for their lives. While the guards covering their escape fell one after another, Carol quickly pressed herself against the wall to hide. Sure enough, the pursuers burst out right after. Carol couldn't ignore it. So,
Excuse?
after taking down 2 soldiers, Carol immediately ran down the passage she had just come through, heading for the exit. She hadn't expected to encounter another patrol just as she stepped out. Carol was about to sneak up on the soldier, highly alert, turned to check his surroundings and started walking toward her hiding spot. With a swift strike, Carol managed to ambush him, and after pulling out her knife, she turned to continue on her way. Not knowing Daryl's exact location, she had no choice but to follow the path, hoping for some luck. Meanwhile, Isabelle, who had been unconscious for a long time, finally woke up. It took her a moment to recall what had happened, and the sharp pain reminded her that she needed to save herself. She struggled, slowly rising from the floor. 10 minutes later, Isabelle was painstakingly making her way out of the room, her steps sluggish and shaky as gunshots echoed intermittently in the distance. Genet's forces had already reached this area. The guards at the entrance were fully engaged in battle, but Isabelle didn't think about seeking help. Instead, she dragged herself forward, leaving bloody footprints with each step. The guards fell one after another, none of them noticing the severely injured woman. Isabelle continued along the wall, determined to return to the prison to rescue Daryl. The fighting would end sooner or later, and whether her side won or lost, they would kill them both. Just then, a dark figure suddenly lunged out from nearby. As soon as Isabelle heard the noise, she saw zombies pounce at her. It took Isabelle a moment to regain her composure and look up at the woman who had just fired her gun. Carol quickly approached. Seeing how badly injured Isabelle was, she looked around and, finding no immediate danger, helped Isabelle over to the wall. It was a simple guard rest area, offering them a place to use briefly. Carol found some cloth on a nearby chair, intending to tend to Isabelle's wounds. She had intended to leave quickly, but seeing Isabelle's condition, she found a blanket and draped it over her. Isabelle sensed that Carol had another motive.
What are you doing here?
I'm looking for a friend of mine from America.
At the same time, a man ran down the hallway toward the prison cells, with a rabid zombie close on his heels. Frantically, he searched for the cell keys, hoping to escape his pursuer. Luckily, he managed to lock himself, and just as the zombie lunged, the man slowly backed away, while the zombie scratched and howled at the bars. But soon it shifted its attention elsewhere, and the man sighed in relief, grateful to have survived. Daryl silently observed him. When the man finally noticed him, Daryl raised his shackled left hand, signaling that he could join the fight. With his flail in hand, Daryl dispatched anyone daring enough to approach him with clean, ruthless precision. Even when facing armed soldiers, he showed no fear. Suddenly, a zombie attacked the soldier from the side, and Daryl's flail swiftly smashed down on the next person's head. In this place, there was no need to discern friend from foe. He could rely on instinct alone to kill. From confusion to shock, From mutual recognition to tearful embraces, true family members appear when help is needed most. No matter the obstacles, they must ensure each other's safety. 5 minutes later, Carol brought Daryl to Isabelle. Daryl rushed over in a panic. He hadn't expected to see a scene like this. He quickly pulled back the blanket to check, only to see that the cloth Isabelle pressed against her wound was soaked with blood. He hurriedly grabbed what remained to try to stop her bleeding.
It's not too late. Not like this.
Isabelle, with slow but determined resolve, refused his help. Her wound was between her ribs. Piercing her internal organs, there was no chance left for her. She only wanted to stay with Daryl for a little while longer.
We can do that together.
Make sure he's taken care of. That he knows I'm always.
Without hesitation, Daryl nodded. Having already considered Isabelle as family, he promised to take them all back to America, but he'd never imagined it would end like this. Goodbyes are always so sudden, and so heartbreaking. Carol offered Daryl silent comfort, knowing he must have been through so much. Perhaps, in the end, only time could heal all of this. Half an hour later, Daryl and Carol had successfully escaped from Nest. Daryl walked briskly, repeatedly urging Carol to keep up. Although Carol wasn't sure why Daryl was in such a rush, she could tell he was in a bad mood. So she deliberately brought up the plane and talked about going home. Everyone in Alexandria missed him dearly, but Daryl didn't respond at all.
You knew her pretty well. I know. Who is she talking about taking care of?
This way.
Meanwhile, inside Nest, Losun was still fighting back with all his strength. In just a few moves, he knocked the soldiers to the ground, but the others had already been subdued. Just as he was about to strike again, a voice suddenly ordered him to stop. Genet's main forces had arrived, signaling that the battle's outcome was settled. Genet stepped forward, reminding him that the entire castle was now under military control, and he'd be better off abandoning his futile resistance. Though he was unwilling, Losun lowered his head and accepted his fate. Half an hour later, Genet began interrogating Losun, trying to extract Laurent's whereabouts. Unexpectedly, Losun advised her to stop searching. That child, he said, was merely a tool for them, but God had always been on his side, protecting him from the likes of them. Genet couldn't help but argue.
Does the American work for God?
We all serve him. Whether we believe or not, even you.
So if I find the boy, it would prove God is on my side. Ratisser les environs, ne pas pu aller bien loin.
After giving the order to pursue, Genet turned to Losun. The battle between their factions had already been decided, but Genet still wanted Losun to understand before he died that, in the face of absolute power, God's choices were irrelevant. Elsewhere, Daryl finally reached the cave and called out loudly for Laurent, but there was no one inside. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion. Where could Laurent have gone? He crouched down and touched the ashes in the fire pit. The coldness told him that Laurent and Fallow had left a long time ago. Daryl considered the worst-case scenario that Laurent and Fallow might not have escaped Nest at all. Just then, he rushed toward a stone wall, removed a loose stone, and found a Rubik's Cube inside.
He was here.
Okay.
He left this for me.
Okay, hey. Let's find them together, okay?
A look of relief crossed Daryl's face, and he nodded before turning to head back out. Since Laurent left the Rubik's Cube here, it means he and Fallow can't have gone far. Daryl and Carol walked along the path for a long time, and their moods gradually began to relax. They each began recounting their experiences along the way, and eventually, the conversation returned to Alexandria. As they walked, Daryl and Carol looked at the manor house not far away at the same time, and then stopped. Carol reflected on everything that had happened over the past few days. Amidst a series of surprises and accidents, she arrived in this strange but fascinating place.
Is you speaking French? Me, you here? This is crazy.
No, it's stupid.
It's crazy.
Daryl and Carol bickered like children, making the journey feel far less dull. Carol brought up Cadron, mentioning how he had pointed her in the right direction and helped her in the heat of battle. Daryl was surprised. Cadron had been hunting him relentlessly, yet he'd also helped him twice at critical moments, each time saying it was for Laurent's sake. Cadron was a truly complex and puzzling man. So, will Daryl and Carol find Laurent in the end? In the previous episode, it was mentioned that Daryl and Carol successfully escaped from the nest, but they did not find Laurent in the cave. They had no choice but to follow the trail and keep moving forward. Daryl and Carol haven't seen each other for a long time and have endless things to talk about. They finally remembered the last phone call.
Just gathering us some fuel. I'll be there in about a week. I promise.
Daryl.
Yeah.
Came back.
Who came back?
Although it wasn't the message Daryl most wanted to hear, the search had already become a part of his life. But now, he had to quickly find Laurent and Fallu, because the tracks on the ground showed that someone had caught up to them. As night fell, the village ahead appeared especially eerie. On the side of the road, various zombies were bound and continuously emitting terrifying growls. Daryl took the lead, carefully steering around these contraptions, while Carol cautiously followed behind. They weren't scared, but the atmosphere felt too strange. They had no idea who had set up these frightening traps, so they decided to proceed with caution. Soon, Daryl and Carol arrived at a small yard at the end of the path. Strangely, the gate was wide open, and even the house was easily accessible. Daryl didn't dare let his guard down, as there were too many strange people in the post-apocalyptic world, and this could be another trap. He raised his shotgun, vigilantly scanning the surroundings. The room was tidy, indicating that someone was still living there. They decided to continue into the house and turned down a hallway that led to the stairs going down. Sure enough, there was a room downstairs with lights on. Daryl immediately turned to Carol, signaling her to be ready and cooperate.
Monsieur Dixon?
Carol looked at Daryl, puzzled, but Daryl didn't know what was going on either. The elderly couple at the dining table introduced themselves and then told Daryl that Laurent had explained in advance that they would be coming here soon. Upon hearing this, Daryl lowered his guard. 5 minutes later, 2 more servings of food were added to the table, and the elderly couple warmly invited them to eat. Daryl and Carol finally enjoyed a hearty meal. Carol expressed her gratitude, praising the food as delicious. At that moment, Theo began to explain what had happened earlier. He had encountered Fallu and Laurent while out, and seeing that they were cold and hungry, he offered them help. Daryl was naturally pleased to hear that Fallu and Laurent were safe.
They left on foot?
To Paris?
Yeah.
No, I'll find them a car.
Can you find us a car?
I have many here. Maybe you can make one to work.
Just as Daryl was about to speak, Carol interrupted him. She knew what he was thinking, but it was too dark outside. Daryl immediately understood her hint and dropped the idea of going out. Seeing this, Dee quickly intervened, telling Daryl and Isabelle to rest and take it easy for now. Carol gave an awkward smile but didn't plan to clarify her identity. Daryl couldn't help but chuckle. The next day, Daryl followed Theo to the garage and indeed found several cars, though they had signs of being refurbished. It was clear they hadn't been used in a long time. Having fuel would make things much easier. Daryl walked over to the last car and found that it was in decent condition, but still needed a few parts replaced. Theo thought of a place where they might be able to find the parts, but he needed to go back and grab some tools first. Daryl had no objections and was prepared to go back with Theo. Meanwhile, Carol and Dee were preparing lunch. The two women chatted about everyday trivialities. Dee was very fond of Laurent, constantly talking about him. Carol smiled knowingly.
Why do I get the feeling you're trying to tell me something?
Laurent thinks that Daryl loves you but won't say it because if he says it, he won't be able to leave.
Now she understood Daryl's little secret. No wonder he always got anxious whenever the topic of going home came up. It turns out, Daryl doesn't want to leave because he's reluctant to part with certain people. Dee still treated Carol as Isabelle and shared many things directly with her. Carol decided to go with the flow and continued the conversation about Dee's family matters. To her surprise, Dee had a very open-minded attitude towards marriage. She and Theo weren't actually married. They only started living together a few years ago. Her own family had all passed away. At that moment, Theo and Daryl returned. As soon as they met, Theo and the elderly couple warmly began dancing. The onlookers, Daryl and Carol, glanced at each other. So this is the kind of romance that's in the French genes. Half an hour later, Daryl and the group set off to find the parts. Compared to the previous night, the village during the day felt much calmer, but the eerie atmosphere still lingered. Every house had zombies locked up in the yards. Theo, with complete ease, even waved hello to the zombies. From his description, it seems that this state of coexistence has been going on for a long time.
Old people burying old people, too hard. So when someone dies, we lock the gate and pay respect when we pass by.
Although Theo had a point, Daryl and Carol still found it strange. No sane person would keep danger so close. After all, many accidents happen just like that. Fortunately, they had reached their destination. Theo jumped off the cart and walked toward a small yard. Before entering, he specifically told Daryl and Carol to wait there. Daryl, as usual, kept an eye on the surroundings. Carol took the opportunity to ask him about Laurent. She suggested that if Daryl wanted, the boy could probably integrate well into the Federation. To Carol's surprise, Daryl denied it. He felt Laurent would be better off staying in Paris, where there were familiar surroundings and friends.
Maybe I don't want that.
What about the kids back home?
This is different.
Is it?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I don't want to lose him.
Will you end up like me? Is that what you're afraid of?
Daryl was stunned. He hadn't expected Carol to see right through him, but he still insisted that he wasn't afraid. Carol sighed helplessly. Daryl's concern for Laurent was so obvious, and she didn't know what Daryl was being stubborn about. Just then, Theo finally came out and called Daryl and Carol into the house. They arrived at the garage, where a well-maintained vintage car was parked. Daryl lifted the hood and saw that it indeed had the parts he needed. The car's owner, who stood on the other side, was friendly enough. After a few casual words, he walked away. Daryl didn't waste any time. After thanking the man, he began to dismantle the parts. Half an hour later, Daryl and Carol returned to Theo's house with the parts and immediately started working on the car. Dee brought them afternoon tea and suggested that she and Carol go to get some ethanol fuel. The two of them headed toward a nearby barn, but Carol suddenly stopped in her tracks. That nightmare returned, the growls of zombies mixed with the sound of a woman crying.
Sister Isabelle.
Dee noticed that something was off with Carol and cautiously asked her what was wrong. Carol only said she had a little daughter, and Dee immediately understood everything. She stepped forward and slowly embraced Carol. They had shared similar experiences and could truly understand each other's emotions. Dee had come to terms with these things, and now she wanted to help Carol find some peace. 1 hour later, Daryl was still working on the car. Carol returned to the driver's seat to help with the gas pedal, but their coordination was a bit off. At that moment, a military vehicle approached from the distance. The group immediately tensed and went on high alert at the sound. Theo spoke up, telling Daryl and Carol to hide in the car, because the approaching vehicle belonged to Genet's soldiers. The military vehicle quickly came to a stop in the open area, and a soldier stepped out, walking straight up to Theo. Inside the car, Daryl and Carol were on edge, afraid that the soldiers might suddenly take action, but it seemed like they were just arguing with each other. At that moment, Dee walked over with 2 baskets of food. The soldier immediately reached out to take them and placed them in the back of the vehicle. The soldier's attitude was far from polite. He seemed to be accustomed to doing this sort of thing. Soon, the soldiers drove off. The elderly couple had long harbored resentment towards the soldiers, so they refrained from revealing Daryl and Carol's location. It was clear that this place was no longer safe. Daryl and Carol worked quickly to repair the car, but as the sky grew darker, they realized they would have to stay the night. Daryl and Carol discussed their next move. It was obvious that Genet had won this battle, and they would soon be surrounded. But Daryl had been avoiding the topic of going home, so Carol wanted to know his true feelings. She handed Daryl a small gift from Judith, a knight with wings.
How was she? She didn't want me to go. Part of her knew I had to if there was a chance I could find you. I guess I'm just surprised you got so close to people here.
I didn't mean to. It's hard to explain, I guess.
Carol, very understanding, said that if he ever wanted to talk, he could come to her anytime. Once the misunderstanding was cleared, their small friction from earlier in the day was put behind them. Early the next morning, Daryl and Carol began packing their things in preparation to leave. Theo hurried over to stop them, saying that breakfast was ready at the house, just as a way to bid them farewell. At his earnest invitation, Daryl and Carol reluctantly agreed. They planned to quickly eat breakfast and then say their goodbyes.
And for all you've done.
What are your plans? After you find Laurent, will you stay in Paris?
Oh no, we're still working it out.
After Daryl answered Dee's question, the atmosphere immediately fell silent. Daryl quickly finished his food. Suddenly, the roar of a car engine came from outside. Daryl immediately stood up to check, and once again, it was the same soldiers from the day before. Carol sensed something was wrong and turned to look. Theo had already drawn his gun and was pointing it at them. The betrayal came so suddenly that even Dee couldn't react in time. She questioned Theo, asking why he was doing this, but Theo explained that they were getting old, and living in a village full of zombies made it hard to survive their later years. Only by siding with the victors could they secure a chance at survival. Dee was disgusted by Theo's actions.
Come with me. Vieux fou.
She immediately led Daryl and Carol to find a way out. However, Daryl and Carol tried to sneak away but realized it was too late. Genet and her elite team were already outside, blocking the exit. They had their guns ready and were preparing to search the area. Daryl grabbed a weapon and, following Dee's instructions, slipped into one of the rooms to hide. Just then, Genet pushed the door open and walked in. Dee naturally closed the door behind him and politely greeted Genet. She told her that Daryl and the others had left after breakfast. They had tried to delay them as much as possible, but Daryl and his group were too suspicious and insisted on leaving. Genet nodded when she heard this. This was indeed the way those two people acted. Meanwhile, Daryl and Carol had made their way around to the other side of the house. There was a window in this room that allowed them to observe the soldiers outside.
Here, cover me. I'll get the car.
Carol immediately became alert, carefully watching every movement outside the window. On the other side, Genet leisurely walked around the room and then pointed to the dining table, asking if she could have something to eat. Theo quickly went over and prepared new utensils for Genet, then returned to his previous position. He was filled with unease. His plan to betray Daryl had failed, and now he had to cover for them instead. As Genet ate, he complimented their cooking skills. While Genet and the Theo couple chatted casually inside, Daryl quietly slipped into the garage. He waved to Carol, signaling her to follow. Carol, seeing this, immediately turned and walked away. As she crouched down to pass a window, she overheard the conversation inside.
C'est l'ennemi, en vérité. Nous sommes en guerre. Vous savez qui je suis?
Oui, j'ai entendu parler de vous. Par mon père.
Genet was a little surprised to hear this, because Dee's age meant that her father would be quite old, but Dee answered that her father had died during World War II, but she could instinctively recognize the signs of a dictator's rule. Genet's expression immediately darkened. This old woman had dared to insult her to her face. Meanwhile, Daryl quietly opened the car door, hoping to grab the weapons from the back seat. Just then, a soldier suddenly walked toward the garage. Daryl had no choice but to stop what he was doing, retreating to hide behind a nearby wall and waiting for an opportunity. Carol had just poked her head out when Daryl quickly gestured for her to stay back. Carol retreated back, but then she heard voices coming from inside the house. Theo tried to urge Dee not to provoke them, but Dee shot him a look and insisted that Daryl and the others had already left. Genet immediately countered, asking why the food on the table was still warm. As soon as Genet spoke, everyone tensed up. Theo and Dee were so nervous they couldn't even look at her.
Ils sont là quelque part.
On va fouiller la maison.
Non. Qu'ils le fassent, eux. S'il y a bien une chose dont les morts sont capables, c'est flairer les vivants.
As soon as the words were spoken, the soldier began loading the injection gun with ampoule serum. She was preparing to turn the elderly couple into mutated zombies to help track down Daryl and Carol. The soldier nearby was about to make a move when suddenly... The soldiers outside heard the gunshot and rushed toward the sound. Daryl immediately struck the metal box to create a noise, hoping to draw the soldiers' attention and help divert the focus from Carol. Sure enough, the soldiers moved toward the sound. On the other side, Carol opened the door and stepped in. She instantly took down the soldier in front of her, then carefully stepped around the elderly couple embracing on the floor and made her way toward the back staircase. On the second floor, Carol is on guard with her shotgun, searching for any sign of Genet through the crack in the door, but apart from the open door, she saw no one. Suddenly, there was a slight sound of movement. Carol immediately fired 2 shots at the door frame, then quickly ducked to the side, waiting for the counterattack. The enemy's bullets did come, but Carol's shotgun was out of ammo. She was about to retreat the way she came, but the soldiers had already blocked the door, and the door behind her was kicked open. Genet, holding a gun, walked into the room. Now, Carol had nowhere left to escape. Genet slowly lowered her handgun, and she began to speak about how the apocalypse had destroyed everything she once had. The once glorious Paris had fallen into darkness. The rich fled to villas or castles. The powerful took boats to escape, while ordinary people were left to survive in the broken streets. Barely hanging on, Carol could understand Genet's feelings, but she despised the ruthless, authoritarian methods Genet had adopted. Genet thought Carol would still understand her, but now, it seemed that wasn't the case. At Genet's signal, the soldiers raised their guns. Suddenly, the situation turned around too quickly. Genet showed a rare moment of fear. Carol, grabbing a weapon she had picked up, aimed and fired at Genet. To Carol's surprise, Genet didn't die. Instead, she frantically tried to pull out a syringe. It was then that Carol realized the gun had been loaded with a mutation serum. Although it wasn't her intention, in this situation, she could only watch and see what would happen next. Daryl, still on the other side, was extremely cautious. He had never seen someone injected with the mutation serum, and he wasn't sure what the consequences would be. Genet struggled in despair. She unexpectedly saw her grotesque reflection in a mirror. In the next moment, her consciousness began to crumble, and she collapsed, convulsing violently on the floor. Carol and Daryl watched in shock as Genet writhed and then lay still, dying from the effects of the zombie serum. After a moment of stunned silence, they both let out a small sigh of relief. Carol got to her feet, waiting for Daryl to come over and join her. Genet paid the price for her own malicious actions, dying from her own ampere serum. A minute later, Carol pushed open the door to the dining room and saw Theo holding Dee Dee in his arms, crying. She quickly walked over to check, but Dee Dee had been badly shot and was already dead. Theo was filled with regret, but he knew it was too late now. His betrayal ultimately hurt the one he loved. By the afternoon, they had buried Dee Dee together, and Theo knelt beside the grave, repenting, but the kind and upright Dee Dee never forgave Theo until the end. Daryl placed the shovel aside and then turned to follow Carol as they left. That night, Daryl and Carol packed up their belongings again, preparing to leave. Carol found a map and started planning their route ahead of time. Daryl walked over and leaned against the car, telling her about his experiences in France. At first, he hadn't had much affection for Isabelle. Their relationship had been more of a mutual benefit. Later, they reached an agreement to escort Laurent, and Laurent became the glue that held them together. After many accidents and adventures, Daryl and Isabelle slowly realized they cared for each other. Carol nodded in understanding. Daryl smiled and silently agreed.
Stop trying to get home to you. The longer I stayed here, the harder it got.
You left her.
Today's events had made him realize a lot of things. He didn't want to hide anything from his family anymore, so he directly told Carol that he wanted to take Laurent back to the United States. Carol smiled and said she understood, and they both got into the car to leave. At the Union of Hope headquarters, Losang and Jacinta received some good news. Genet had been killed by Daryl and Carol, but Losang's train of thought was strangely unconventional.
Marine's way was not enough. But neither is yours.
Jacinta, ever sharp, could tell that Sabine's words had an underlying meaning. She quickly asked, "What do we do next?" Dr. Lafleur looked at Sabine. Both of them had been loyal subordinates of Genet. Now, with the leader gone, they had no one suitable to follow, and could only resort to this last option. Half an hour later, Losang walked into the hall with a radiant look on his face. He stepped to the front of the crowd, and the noisy group quickly fell silent.
All is forgiven. My friends. Tout est pardonné.
Seeing the puzzled faces of the people, Losang spoke again. "The war is over. Genet's army will join our family. We will unite our dreams, merge our ideas, and build a stronger, better future together. And as I promised, Laurent will lead us to immunity from the virus. From now on, no one will have to fear zombies anymore."
Allons trouver l'enfant.
The next day, Fallou was discussing post-war reconstruction with Nadine. Nadine said that the people in the camp were all in a state of panic, not knowing what had happened at the nest. Fallou explained, "Leader Losang has lost his mind and misled many people, like Emile, but we must hold fast to our faith and keep surviving." Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and they immediately became alert. The gates slowly lifted, and a figure suddenly collapsed to the ground. Fallou and the others approached and saw a figure wearing a hat, their head lowered, making it impossible to see their face. Fallou dragged Cadran with him into the camp, furious that this man had caused so much harm to them yet still dared to return. Fallou forcefully pushed Cadran to the ground, demanding to know what his intentions were. People from the camp gathered around, and Laurent stood high up, watching the scene. Everyone looked up when Laurent spoke, explaining, "This man had the chance to kill me, but he stopped his teammates and even let us go." Everyone was shocked to hear this. Caudron, relieved, explained his reasons for coming. "I just escaped from the nest. Genet has taken control of leader Laurent," he said.
Tant mieux. C'est ce qu'il mérite. Mais alors? Et Daryl?
Caudron answered that he had also been captured by Genet and didn't know the situation of the others. However, there was an American woman who had rescued him, and she was also looking for Daryl. Laurent thought for a moment and asked,
Est-ce qu'elle s'appelle Carole?
"Will Carol and Daryl successfully find Laurent? What action will Laurent take next?" Stay tuned for the exciting developments in the next episode. In the previous episode, Carol and Daryl embarked on a journey to find Laurent. Along the way, Genet led her troops to track them down, but Carol used the Amper serum to take Genet out. As a fan of The Walking Dead, I can't help but exclaim, is Daryl really not worthy of a happy ending? Just as he and Isabelle had finally confirmed their feelings for each other, they were torn apart forever. Daryl was lost in his memories.
Daryl.
Huh?
Try it one more time. You're right, it's fried.
Carol could sense Daryl's sorrow but chose not to ask any questions. She just needed to pick up her backpack and accompany her old friend to finish the rest. Daryl had been in France for a long time now. Now that Isabelle was gone, the only thing he could do was take Laurent back to America and try to give him a good life. The fastest way for them to return to America was through Carol's pilot friend, Ash. Before long, Carol brought Daryl to the racetrack. It was where she and Ash had landed the plane before, but as they got closer, she grew uneasy. She wasn't sure how to face Ash, especially since she had lied to him about coming to France to search for her daughter.
Okay, look. What I said to him, to persuade him to do this whole thing, I embellished some facts.
You lied?
Of course, Daryl didn't know about that either. With no other choice, Carol braced herself and walked with Daryl toward the racetrack. She could already imagine Ash's fury. When they arrived at the spot where the plane had been parked, they found it covered with iron panels Ash had used to shield it. Carol called out a few times, but no one responded. Carol pulled open the door, only to see a thin wire on the ground. It was undoubtedly one of Ash's traps. Carol drew her knife and stepped inside. There was no sign of Ash, but the fact that he'd set up traps was unsettling. Had something happened to him? She searched frantically, her eyes filled with worry. Suddenly, Daryl called her over. "There were 2 zombies over here." It was clear that someone had tried to break in and ended up triggering the trap. Just as Daryl was about to take out the second zombie, he realized the man wasn't actually dead. Carol hurriedly asked the man about the plane's owner.
He never come back.
What were you doing here?
We came to find the plane.
It seems that when they landed before, they were noticed by someone, so they came here to try to seize the plane, but they never expected to die here. The man, knowing he wouldn't survive, begged Daryl to put him out of his misery.
I got this.
From the man's account, it became clear that Ash had left the area and hadn't returned. But where could Ash have gone? What Carol didn't know was that Ash went out that night to look for fuel, but never imagined that he would be targeted by a group of zombies. Ash tried to escape, but the path ahead was blocked. Thankfully, he spotted a nearby car, quickly opened the door, and climbed inside. Frantically, he searched for the keys. If he could start the car, he might be able to make it out alive. But luck wasn't on Ash's side. He found the keys, but the car wouldn't start. It had clearly been abandoned for far too long. As he cursed his misfortune, the first zombie threw itself against the car window, with more closing in behind it. Ash thought to himself that he couldn't allow himself to die here. Just as he resolved to burst out of the car, the sheer force of a zombie hitting the door caused it to slam back into him. The impact left him dazed, the world around him spinning as he lost all strength. Within a minute, the car was surrounded by zombies. If no one came to the rescue, Ash's fate would either be to starve to death or to be eaten by the zombies. After opening the door, Daryl and Carol didn't find Ash at the racetrack, so they decided to head back to the camp to pick up Laurent. On the way, Daryl couldn't help but wonder what excuse Carol had used to convince Ash to come to France in the first place. Before Carol could finish explaining, Nadine came running up to greet Daryl. They had arrived at the camp. Inside the camp, Caudron was quietly eating his meal while Fallow asked him why he had come here.
Pense à mon frère, Michel. Mes parents, les hommes dans le sud, tous morts. Tous ceux que j'ai voulu protéger, tous ceux que j'ai aimés, ils sont morts. Et pourquoi?
In truth, Kadran was just a lonely, pitiful soul now. He had no purpose and no place to call home. At that moment, the gate opened, and Daryl and Carol walked in. Laurent shouted Daryl's name with joy and quickly ran over to embrace the man who was both like a father and a friend to him.
You're back. The Commonwealth, right?
That's right.
Daryl's eyes landed on Kadran. This man had been both a rival and an unlikely ally. Daryl didn't say much, instead simply taking Laurent by the hand and walking away. Once inside a room, Daryl broke the news about Isabelle's death. Surprisingly, Laurent remained calm. He said softly, "Sylvie and the others from the Abbey all died because of me. It's terrifying to think that they're no longer in this world." Daryl then brought up the idea of returning to America. He tried to reassure Laurent, saying that everything could start fresh over there, but the Laurent who had once eagerly clamored to go to America now hesitated. After some thought, he said he wanted to stay. Daryl tried to comfort and convince Laurent, but Laurent simply said that he wanted to rest and refused to discuss the matter further. After Daryl left, 2 silent tears rolled down Laurent's cheeks. He had no family left in the world. The next day, to find Ash, Daryl brought Carol to the underground bar he had visited before. Perhaps they could gather some information there. Carol was stunned. She hadn't expected a place like this to exist in the apocalypse. It was no different from the nightclubs of the old world, drinking, dancing, gun trading, everything. She stared in disbelief. At this time, several scantily clad women came up to them of their own accord.
Yeah.
They also noticed some of Genet's former subordinates in the bar. That woman was dead, and most of her forces had crumbled. Even Genet's prized Mona Lisa had been brought here. Of course, the audience wouldn't forget that the original owner of this underground bar was Quinn, but that guy was already dead, and the current person in charge was Anna, the one who had betrayed him.
Daryl, Dixon. I heard you were dead.
Not yet.
Make yourself at home.
Anna and Daryl had no personal grudges. On the contrary, she was rather fond of Laurent, so she readily agreed to help them look for Ash.
I did what I had to. It was Queen. I'm sorry for any, what do you call it? Collateral damage.
Anna's voice caught as she spoke, guilt creeping into her tone. Isabelle's death weighed on her conscience. From this, it was clear that Anna wasn't inherently bad. She had simply been blinded by power and money, forced into difficult choices in the apocalypse. At that moment, Carol suddenly noticed someone at the bar trading an oil drum for drinks. She couldn't sit still and immediately walked over. Looking closely at the English letters on the drum, she realized it was Ash's fuel drum.
Ça sort d'où, ça?
2 guerriers nous ont rapporté, il y a 4 ou 5 jours, Mutant de la maison mère.
Maison mère.
The Maison Mère they mentioned was Genet's former fortress. If the fuel drum came from there, it meant Ash must have been there too. Daryl immediately stated that he needed a vehicle and weapons. Anna was relatively generous and gave them directly and unconditionally. With everything ready, Daryl and Carol headed to Maison Mère as quickly as they could. This place had once been the stronghold of France's most powerful faction, but now, in just a few days, it had fallen into ruin. The surrounding area was littered with corpses, likely people killed in fights over supplies. A few minutes later, Daryl and Carol reached the prisoner holding area. They suspected that Ash might have been captured and brought here, but the cells were filled with bodies. All of them had turned into zombies. They had no choice but to scan the faces through the glass, searching for any sign of Ash. Carol looked very carefully, afraid that Ash had really become one of them.
No. From here.
Carol said this with obvious relief. As long as they couldn't see Ash's body, there was a good chance that Ash was still alive. At that moment, Daryl noticed something suspicious through a window. Outside, dozens of zombies were gathered around a car. This was unusual. Zombies only surrounded vehicles when there was someone alive inside. Even the slightest chance that it was Ash meant they had to check. Without wasting any time, they made their way through the corridors to the courtyard. To draw the zombies' attention, Daryl whistled sharply. Daryl and Carol, the 2 unstoppable warriors of The Walking Dead, made quick work of the zombies trying to close in. However, their limited ammunition forced them to switch weapons, which slowed their pace of clearing the zombies. The open area left them vulnerable to an unending flow of zombies pouring in. Thankfully, they had reached the car and were moments away from checking on the survivor inside. Daryl kicked away the zombies blocking the car door and quickly slammed it shut before more could swarm in. Carol finally let out a sigh of relief, but Ash was clearly in bad shape. He turned his head sluggishly at the sound, confused about where the unfamiliar man in the back seat had come from. Carol's emotions were mixed. Right now, it wasn't about who had helped whom. Their current situation was dangerously dire. Countless zombies pressed against the car, banging furiously on the windows. The noise kept attracting more of the zombies. In this dire situation, even if they gave it their all, it might not be enough to survive. After 5 minutes, the zombies had surrounded the car. Carol and the others could not get out. They could only check on Ash's condition first. Ash was suffering from a concussion and dehydration. While not immediately life-threatening, his condition couldn't be ignored for long. They needed to escape soon, but attempting to break out now would be far too risky. Their only hope was that the storage box inside the car contained weapons. When Daryl finally manages to pry open the metal box, he is stunned when he sees what's inside. There are only special guns and a few anti-serums. Seeing that Ash's condition is getting worse.
Got any ideas?
Not any good ones. What battery? You got any battery left?
Yeah, but this thing's not moving.
Just need to crack a window.
Though Carol didn't know what Daryl was planning, she pressed the button to open the car's sunroof. As it slid open, Daryl stood through the gap, holding the injection gun. He scanned the area carefully and quickly located a suitable enhanced carrier. The Emperor serum began to take effect, and Daryl swiftly switched to another injection gun to target the next subject. The zombie soldier in the distance seemed like an ideal candidate. After doing this, Daryl quickly hides back in the car, and Carol then closes the sunroof of the car. All they could do now was wait and hope the berserker zombies would unleash their violent instincts to thin out the horde. Daryl had encountered berserker zombies twice before and had learned that under the influence of the serum, they would attack the nearest living beings, whether humans or fellow zombies, tearing them apart with brutal force. Neither Daryl nor Carol had imagined they'd one day find themselves in such a desperate situation, relying on berserker zombies to clear their path. Suddenly, blood splattered across the car windows, and an eerie silence fell over the area. Daryl and Carol stayed on high alert, scanning their surroundings carefully. The berserker zombies were still out there, but from inside the car, Daryl and Carol couldn't see them. They had no idea which window the creatures might burst through next. Daryl and Carol were well aware of the danger posed by the berserker zombies, so they remained on high alert at all times. Suddenly, the fight was over in an instant, but it had taken every ounce of strength Daryl and Carol had. Ash finally regained consciousness, completely unaware of what had just transpired. Carol pushed the zombie leaning against the car window off. Daryl opened the car door and observed the area for a moment before slowly stepping out. After confirming there was no immediate danger, he turned back to help the weakened Ash to his feet. The sight around them was shocking. The ground was littered with severed limbs and mangled zombie remains, making even finding a spot to step a challenge. Ash was still incredibly weak, so Daryl had to support him as they moved. With many of the zombies still twitching on the ground, they had to carefully step over the bodies to avoid unnecessary risks. Meanwhile, Laurent took the initiative to talk to Cadron. He knew this man wasn't inherently bad, so he asked Cadron why he had been hunting them. Cadron explained that Daryl had killed his brother, driven by a need for revenge. He had tracked them to the Abbey and, consumed by anger, made a series of terrible decisions. In fact, Cadron had also come to realize his mistakes. He had allowed his personal vendetta to escalate into something that affected the entire group, leading to the deaths of many innocent people. It wasn't until he truly got to know Laurent that he recognized the error of his ways. With that, he pleaded for Laurent's forgiveness.
Je t'ai déjà pardonné. Et j'espère qu'un jour, tu le pardonneras aussi.
In that moment, Cadron seemed to find peace. Perhaps he could learn to live a normal life in the future. At that moment, the gates of the base suddenly swung open, and Losung marched in with his fully armed troops. The camp's residents erupted into chaos. Cadron quickly told Laurent to hide, while he grabbed a shovel in case of emergency. They climbed onto a metal rack and hid in a compartment, watching the situation unfold below. Losung had now reached the center of the camp. He addressed the surrounding residents, assuring them that he meant no harm and that they didn't need to fear Genet's soldiers because they had joined the Union of Hope. He explained that he was there to find Laurent, a child chosen by God, who could guide them toward the path to the future.
We sent Laurent to you, at the nest.
He was taken from us, lured away by the American.
Then, we must find him.
Sonia reacted quickly, immediately rallying everyone into action. Having once received help from Laurent, she wanted to create chaos to help cover Laurent's escape. However, Lo-sung didn't give her the chance and immediately called her out, stopping her in her tracks. Lo-sung then ordered his men to retrieve an object from a nearby table. The people closest to the table turned to look and saw Laurent's Rubik's Cube sitting there. The people in the camp hadn't expected their secret to be exposed so quickly. Lo-sung didn't bother to explain further. He had already guessed that these people were protecting Laurent, so he ordered a full search of the camp. Kadran positioned himself in front of Laurent, prepared to fight if necessary. Fallow was now in a precarious position himself. He was the one who had helped Laurent escape from the nest, but he hadn't expected Lo-sung to track them down here. Seeing that Jacinta was about to locate Laurent, Fallow suddenly grabbed a dagger and rushed out, taking a soldier hostage. Seizing the opportunity, Kadran quietly led Laurent toward the back of the camp. This was the chance Fallow had created for them with his own life, and they couldn't afford to waste it. Lo-sung did not notice anything unusual, and he loudly accused Fallow of being a traitor. Fallow saw that his goal had been achieved, so he simply pushed the hostage out of the way and threw the dagger to indicate his surrender. But Fallow didn't bow to Lo-sung. Instead, he spoke up, telling everyone that Lo-sung was nothing but a deceitful liar who wanted to sacrifice Laurent to consolidate his own power and status. Lo-sung scoffed at the accusation and turned to the residents, explaining that he needed Laurent to save everyone from their suffering. He claimed that God might be dead, but they had to find the child to prove that God was still watching over and protecting them.
That's what faith is. If you need proof, you've already lost it.
Fallow's words left Lo-sung speechless. Sonia seized the moment and began clapping, and the others quickly came to their senses, joining in and applauding in agreement. Kadran took the opportunity to lead Laurent out. Using the applause to mask their movements, they managed to slip away and escape through the rooftop at the back of the camp, while the others continued their resistance. This was the last thing Lo-sung wanted to see. In his mind, it was all because of that damned man, Daryl, that everything had spiraled out of control. Elsewhere, Ash was brought back to the racetrack. Carol carefully settled him into bed to rest before stepping out of the room. Intending to discuss their return plans with Daryl, Carol and Daryl sat together on the bleachers overlooking the racetrack. Daryl encouraged her to take the chance to tell Ash the truth, but Carol was deeply conflicted. She knew Ash had lost his son, so she used the story of searching for her daughter to gain his sympathy. That lie had hit Ash in his most vulnerable spot, and she felt the truth would need time to sink in. Daryl understood and told her to stay behind and prepare supplies while he went out to gather fuel. Half an hour later, Daryl arrived at the underground bar he had visited before and went straight to Anna. She looked visibly surprised to see him. Although Daryl was skeptical, he still followed Anna further inside. To his shock, he saw Laurent sitting there. He immediately grabbed Laurent, carefully checking him over, completely missing the fact that Kadran was standing nearby.
So I brought him here.
Thank you. How are you? What about everyone else? They alright?
Yeah.
As long as I'm interested in one thing.
Daryl instantly understood what Kadran meant. Lo-sung, that scumbag, still wouldn't give up on Laurent. Daryl turned to Anna again, asking her for one more favor.
Again? People are gonna talk.
Although Anna said so, she didn't hesitate to agree for Laurent's sake. In the previous episode, Daryl and Carol found Ash. Meanwhile, after Laurent and Kadran escaped the base, they ran into Daryl at an underground bar. Now, Daryl finally has a chance to go home, but he's missing fuel for the plane. Anna steps up once again, offering her help unconditionally. Anna isn't exactly a good person, but maybe she sees a sliver of innocence in Laurent, a purity that stirs something in her. With surprising generosity, she orders her men to load ethanol for Daryl.
Not sure we have enough to just give it away.
I'm sorry. It sounded like you were trying to express an opinion. Didn't think so. Faster?
The man lowered his head, silently enduring her orders, but it seemed he and another man were secretly conspiring about something. Before long, they begin preparing the fuel, but no one notices when one of the men quietly slips out of the bar. Meanwhile, upstairs, Daryl is trying to convince Laurent to return to America with him. He promises Laurent that once they're there, he'll make new friends and start over, but for some reason, Laurent is stubbornly refusing. Daryl couldn't comprehend Laurent's obstinacy, and it made him a bit angry.
Why?
I don't want to.
Explain it to me.
I just can't.
Why not?
Because I don't want you to die.
Finally, Laurent confesses the truth. He believes the nun Sylvie, Isabelle, died because of him. Everyone he loves and everyone who loves him seems doomed to a tragic fate. Daryl shakes his head, just about to offer words of comfort, when a commotion erupts downstairs. Anna strode upstairs, dragging a dancer along with her. She orders 2 other performers to buy them some time. It turns out the man who left earlier wasn't happy with Anna's decisions. He secretly tipped off Laurent. Thankfully, one of the young workers loading the fuel is loyal. He warns Cadron it's time to leave and points out a hidden passage behind the liquor cabinet.
Come on, go.
Just as Daryl and the others were moving towards the inside of the house, they were seen by Jacinta, who had turned her head.
Lozang, il est là.
By the time Laurent and his men storm upstairs, they find only Anna sitting calmly on the couch. It's clear she's playing against them. As a leader, Laurent lacks the ruthlessness to truly dominate. If it were Genet in his place, this bar would already have a new owner. Just then, Jacinta notices a breeze around the nearby lamp. A concealed passage lies behind a painting, clearly the route Daryl and the others used to escape. Without hesitation, Laurent leads his men into the passage. This basement was designed for emergencies and is rarely used. Daryl and Laurent haven't gone far when they bump into Cadron. After the 3 reunited, they faced another challenge. They were unfamiliar with the area, and the sound of pursuing footsteps was quickly closing in behind them. Daryl quickly decides to split up. He plans to use the terrain to take out Laurent's men one by one. After running for a bit, Daryl instructs Laurent to hide in a nearby alcove and wait for him. He warns Laurent to stay put, as the upcoming fight will leave him no time to watch over him.
Yeah, turn it up. We're gonna get through this, okay?
The pursuers flood into the basement, armed with guns, vowing not to fail this time. Laurent surveys the floor, noticing footprints leading to 2 different paths. He orders Jacinta to take a squad left, while he and the rest head right. From this point on, their fate is sealed. Laurent, at the end of the day, is a soft-hearted, indecisive martial artist. His men are far from elite soldiers, and now they face 2 seasoned warriors. The lack of professionalism becomes apparent quickly. Jacinta's squad panics at the slightest noise. After some effort, they regroup and resume their search. One of the soldiers fumbles through the darkness, his nerves on edge, when suddenly, Jacinta heard the commotion and rushed over with 2 subordinates, but she quickly made yet another mistake. She signaled for her 2 subordinates to split up and flank the target, while she crept along the wall to investigate. It was obvious she was nothing more than a paper strategist, a devout believer who had been lucky enough to stumble into a position of power. As expected, the sound of gunfire soon echoed through the passage. The female subordinate who had gone to flank the target lay lifeless on the ground. The remaining man, an older subordinate, was gripped with fear, terrified that he might meet the same fate. Cadron emerged with a fierce expression, with only Jacinta left. He no longer felt the need to stay hidden. Jacinta was visibly afraid. She hadn't brought a gun. After all, she was used to relying on others to do the dirty work. But now, she had no choice but to feign fearlessness. Cadron was not only tall and strong but also highly skilled in combat. Within a few moves, he had Jacinta by the throat. But Cadron never expected that Jacinta had a dagger hidden at her waist. Jacinta felt a surge of triumph. She had one, but... Elsewhere, Laurent had similarly ordered his men to split up and search. As predicted, when Laurent followed the sound of a scuffle, he found several of his subordinates convulsing on the ground. At that moment, Daryl stepped out from the shadows, a knife in his left hand and a flail in his right. A brutal melee was about to begin. Daryl took a hit from Laurent's staff, and the pain was immediate and sharp. Laurent practiced Aikido, also known as the Way of Harmony, a discipline sharing roots with Morgan's staff techniques. His combat skills far exceeded Daryl's expectations. Laurent's relentless strikes left Daryl in agony. Unable to recover, He could only crawl helplessly on the ground, but Daryl had been through far too much in the post-apocalyptic world. To him, the process didn't matter, only the outcome did. He grabbed a skull from the ground, mustering all his strength to swing it and smash it against Lozang's head. And just like that, another great leader fell, following in Genet's footsteps. Ironically, Lozang had founded the Union of Hope with good intentions, but under Jacinta's manipulation, he had lost his way. Daryl soon found Laurent, and Cadron joined them shortly after. The three let out a collective sigh of relief. Everyone was safe, and the battle had been a resounding victory. However, Cadron ultimately showed mercy. Jacinta was still alive. Despite Daryl and Cadron teaming up to take down Lozang, their relationship remained complex. They might never be friends, but for now, they were no longer enemies. Anna, who had played a crucial role in helping them, was also there. She bid farewell to Laurent, telling him her territory would always welcome him. Then, with her men, she left. The ordeal was over at last. Nothing stood in the way of Daryl's return to America. Yet Laurent, as stubborn as ever, insisted on staying behind. Daryl spoke to him patiently. "You may be a kid now, but one day, you'll grow into a man who can stand on his own and face any challenge. You have to let go of the things that scare you and face them head on. Isabelle wanted you to go to America, and I want that for you too."
Okay.
Good. Go get your shit. Let's go.
Laurent was silent for 2 seconds before finally agreeing. Then they drove to the racetrack. With the fuel now secured, they would soon board a plane to leave France. Laurent, who had figured everything out on the way, also relaxed. He began to look forward to his new life in America. Meanwhile, Daryl was distracted. Daryl was on his way back with the fuel, but she still hadn't told Ash the truth. At this time, Ash's body recovered a little and he slowly walked out. Ash noticed something off about Carol's expression. At first, he thought she had found her daughter, but then he realized the heartbreaking truth: they were separated forever. Carol sighed deeply. She knew there was no avoiding it. She decided it was time to come clean.
I'm sorry.
For what?
All of it?
Oh, this is true. Help me.
I helped you?
Get past the guilt I've been carrying about Abby. Coming here with you just forced me to overcome it. To live again. You did that for me, Carol.
Carol froze, still lacking the courage to reveal the truth. She could not bear to see Ash devastated again.
I'm really sorry I didn't have better for you.
With the burden weighing heavily on her mind, Carol couldn't sit still. She busied herself, scrubbing the plane over and over again. Ash saw that Carol was troubled. Thinking she was still grieving for her daughter, he walked over to console her. Carol couldn't keep it hidden any longer. She blurted out, "Thank you for helping me so much. I'm grateful this journey has been meaningful to you. But the truth is, I lied. I didn't come here to find Sophia at all, but to find that Daryl you met."
What are you saying?
Sophia died 12 years ago.
No, you said that.
No, I know what I said. It's not like that.
What's it like then?
Daryl explained, "Sophia died a long time ago. I've just never been able to forgive myself, so I pretended she was still alive. Lately, these illusions have been getting worse." She continued, "When I met you, I felt like you could understand me. That's why I said those things about looking for someone to gain your sympathy and convince you to help me." It finally dawned on Ash. Everything had been a lie. What stung even more was the nature of the lie. Carol hadn't just deceived him, she had used the memory of her dead daughter to do it. What kind of person could do such a thing? As a father who had lost his own son, Ash had often felt a deep connection to Carol. He truly believed she understood his pain. That belief was what had driven him to abandon everything and risk this journey with her. But now, it all felt meaningless, almost laughable. Ash was truly too kind. So kind that even someone as cunning as Carol feared causing him harm. Half an hour later, Daryl returned, with Laurent practically bouncing with excitement. It was his first time seeing a plane in real life, something he'd only read about in books. Hearing the commotion, Carol came out and was surprised to see Daryl had brought the boy back with him. It seemed Daryl just couldn't let go of the kid. Carol gave a knowing smile. Since their earlier conversation, Ash had stormed off in anger, but just as Daryl arrived, Ash returned as well. Still furious, Ash ignored Daryl's greeting, yet his attention was quickly caught by Laurent, who was perched on the plane. Ash saw Laurent and obviously thought of his dead son. Ash's anger had long since subsided, but the sudden addition of another person left him in a difficult spot. The plane could only seat 3 people, which meant they couldn't all leave together. The situation became unexpectedly tricky, forcing them to reconsider their plans. An hour later, Daryl took Laurent outside for a walk. He had found an old guitar in an underground garage and intended to give it to the boy as a gift. Laurent, perceptive as always, guessed that Daryl didn't plan to leave with him.
You're not coming, are you?
Somebody has to stay behind. Makes sense that it's me.
Laurent's mood instantly dropped. There was no point in arguing. Laurent knew Daryl wouldn't change his mind. Still, he worried about Daryl staying behind alone. Daryl quickly reassured Laurent, promising that they would see each other again. Neither knew when that reunion might be, and the thought made them both melancholic. Laurent strummed the guitar, humming a tune. Daryl quietly joined in, though his voice grew increasingly choked with emotion.
Always get what you want. Can't always get what you want. Try sometimes, just might find. Get what you need.
Meanwhile, Carol sought out Ash once more. She knew her actions were unforgivable, and with deep guilt, she said, "Let me stay, please. Take Daryl and Laurent back to America." Ash was conflicted. Although he was furious about the truth, he was nowhere near as cold and unfeeling as he seemed on the surface. Half an hour later, Ash closed his toolbox, preparing to head out for a while. Carol was not far away gathering supplies, but her eyes kept following Ash's movements. Laurent noticed Ash's simmering anger as well.
He's got a lot on his mind.
Because you lied to him.
Laurent had guessed the reason behind Ash's anger, but then he turned to Carol and said, "Actually, I'm grateful for this lie. Without it, Daryl and I would never have had the chance to come here."
You have a really special way of seeing things, don't you? You're gonna make a lot of friends at the Commonwealth.
Do you think Daryl will be able to make it back by himself?
Hearing Laurent say this, Carol looked back at him. It turned out that Daryl and she had the same thoughts. Elsewhere, Ash searched the underground garage for spare parts, with Daryl holding a flashlight to help.
What happened to his parents?
Laurent? He's an orphan.
Learning that Laurent was an orphan seemed to touch Ash's paternal instincts. Daryl seized the opportunity to explain on Carol's behalf. He told Ash, "Carol's been through hell. Sophia's death nearly destroyed her. I was there when it happened. There's nothing worse than witnessing the loss of a child firsthand." The mention of children softened Ash's heart, and the conversation shifted. He opened up to Daryl, and the two began to talk. It was hard to imagine how someone as kind as Ash had survived this long in such a brutal world. Unable to find the right part, Ash decided to check behind a metal gate, but his lack of caution almost cost him. As he took a few steps forward, Daryl yanked him back just in time to close the gate before a horde of zombies descended. Sometimes, recognition between men is as simple as that.
I guess I am kind of glad you're coming with us.
Daryl was momentarily stunned. He hadn't expected Ash's goodwill to come so easily. Will they be able to leave successfully? And who will ultimately stay behind? Let's look forward to the thrilling events of the next episode. In the previous episode, Daryl and Laurent successfully reunited with Carol. Anna provided Daryl with the fuel needed for the plane, but Ash was furious after Carol revealed the truth. He disclosed that the plane could only carry 3 people, meaning someone would have to be left behind. In a dense, fog-filled forest, a group of survivors was making their way through. Since the leaders of the 2 major gangs, Laurent and Genet, were killed by Daryl one after the other, the situation in France has stabilized. Cadron chooses to stay at Fallow's camp. He usually goes out with Fallow to gather supplies. Recently, a few new people joined the base. The curly-haired woman is named Aquila. She came here to find her sister. Fallow and Aquila fled from the same region, so they have many common topics to talk about. However, this mission could be dangerous, so Fallow instructed Aquila to stay behind and watch the horses while he and Cadron went into the castle to scavenge supplies.
Attention au coup de foudre, hein?
Joking aside, the moment they entered the castle, they became highly alert, carefully making their way up the stairs. As they turned a corner, they spotted a zombie sitting in a wheelchair. However, they did not attack but continued walking upstairs. The castle had previously been converted into a mental hospital. so encountering zombies still strapped to hospital beds didn't surprise them much. The two began searching for anything useful among the wreckage. After more than a decade since the apocalypse began, most medications were clearly expired, but something was better than nothing, so they decided to take whatever they could find. They planned to search for some medical equipment as well. If they managed to gather those, this trip would be considered a success. Fallow decided to check out a nearby room, while Cadron continued searching further inside. It was a tragic sight. The patients had been strapped to their beds, and even after dying and turning into zombies, they remained unable to break free. Cadron walked up to one of the zombies, staring at it for a moment before yanking the cross necklace from its neck. After all, faith was meaningless to the zombies. Just then, Fallow shouted for Cadron from outside. As if he had discovered something, Cadron grabbed his shotgun and was about to head out.
Et doucement.
At that moment, Sabine appeared. She demanded to know where the plane was. Cadron found it strange both leaders Sabine had followed were now dead, so why was she still causing trouble?
Oh non, elle est pas morte, la cause. Sœur Jacinta va veiller à ce que la prophétie se réalise.
Even Cadron was baffled by her actions. With her skills, Sabine could easily start her own group. Instead, she insisted on finding a leader to follow and was hell-bent on chasing down a child from a false prophecy. One of the soldiers nearby immediately began interrogating Cadron, demanding that he reveal the plane's location. Sabine went further, threatening Cadron by saying, "If you don't tell us, I'll kill Fallow." Cadron hesitated. Was he really going to betray his friend just to survive the situation? Suddenly, the situation turned on its head. Fallow chased after him directly with a shotgun, while Aquila followed behind with a bow and arrow. It was Aquila who arrived just in time to save Cadron and Fallow. Meanwhile, Cadron was wrestling with one of the soldiers. Before Aquila could assist, Cadron found an opening, disarmed the soldier, and swiftly took him out. Fallow, who hadn't managed to catch Sabine, returned just in time to witness the scene. That afternoon, Anna and her subordinates were on their way back to the villa. Ever since helping Daryl and Laurent, Anna often found herself thinking about her mother. Her homeland was far away in Russia, and she wondered if she would ever have the chance to see her mother again. Just then, an ATV appeared directly in front of them. Anna's driver had just applied the brakes when a group of people suddenly appeared nearby, armed and demanding that the people in the car get out. In such a situation, Anna still managed to maintain her elegance, but in the end, she stepped out of the car on her own. It was obvious that this military group had been lying in wait for her. As a result, Anna didn't resist right away. When she saw Jacinta, she wasn't surprised at all.
I want the same thing you wanted.
I didn't help him, why help you?
Jacinta immediately turned to her soldiers and gave a signal, and Anna's driver was promptly shot in the leg. Watching her subordinate being beaten, Anna remained completely calm and composed. She even calmly added a remark.
Ouch.
After a brief back and forth, it was Jacinta who lost her patience first. She demanded that Anna reveal the plane's location or she would kill the woman standing nearby. Yet Anna continued to act indifferent, as if she didn't care in the slightest. Realizing that these tactics weren't working on Anna, Jacinta finally set aside her arrogance and asked what Anna wanted. Anna, being a businesswoman at heart, knew when to stop pushing her luck. She admitted that all she wanted was to go home. "I can help you catch Laurent, but I'll keep the plane and the pilot." Jacinta smiled with satisfaction. With Anna's help, she was sure to succeed in her next move. Meanwhile, at the racetrack, Ash was showing Laurent around the interior of the plane. The two seemed to be getting along well. Daryl was off to the side sharpening his dagger, but it was clear that his mind was elsewhere. Even though he had already decided to stay behind, the thought of saying goodbye left him feeling stifled. Carol approached with her hands behind her back and reassured Daryl not to worry. She told him that Ash knew how to take care of the boy. Daryl trusted Ash's character, but he still felt uneasy about leaving Laurent. Holding the crossbow he had finally recovered, Daryl was deeply moved. In the end, all he could say was a simple thank you. Carol takes the opportunity to say,
"Look, I know what you're gonna say. You ain't staying."
Perhaps it was the unspoken understanding between Carol and Daryl. They both knew how far the other would go to protect their family. Carol insisted on staying behind. She said it would allow her to atone for her earlier lies, and she wouldn't have to worry about Daryl putting himself in danger. Ash overheard their conversation.
He's right. He knows how to survive. And you know the plane. You can help me.
Ash, this isn't about that.
It is about whatever can get that kid back to a safe place.
At this point, the most critical issue was ensuring Laurent's safety. By comparison, Carol was still the better choice to accompany them. The decision was made just like that. Just then, there was a sudden noise outside the door, and they immediately took up their weapons and got ready.
Easy. Jacinta's still alive.
They soon realized that to protect both Laurent and the plane, they would need to take off as soon as possible. 10 minutes later, everyone pushed the plane out of the warehouse. Since the plane hadn't been used in a long time, Ash needed to test the engine. At that moment, a convoy arrived at the outskirts of the racetrack. Jacinta had tracked them here with Anna's help, bringing all her elite soldiers. Her methods were even more ruthless than Lozang's, and she couldn't afford to fail this mission. Under Sabine's command, a small group stayed behind to guard the entrance, while the main force marched grandly toward the inner area. Anna walked alone at the front of the group. As she approached the stairwell, she slowed her pace. Her eyes fell on a poster of the Eiffel Tower on the wall, and she was reminded of her first encounter with Laurent.
It will be beautiful again. Someday. I hope you get to go home soon.
So, which way?
Snapping back to the present, Anna spoke. From this staircase, we can reach the parking lot. There's a route that leads directly to the runway. Jacinta glanced at the darkened passageway. Suspicious that Anna might pull a trick, she ordered Anna to lead the way. Anna had only heard reports from her subordinates about the situation here, but she didn't fully understand it herself. Nevertheless, she was the first to step down the stairs. Following the dimly lit staircase, they soon arrived at the parking lot. Ahead, a metal gate blocked the path, and at the far end of the lot was the exit. Hearing Jacinta's urging, Anna pushed the iron door open without hesitation and walked in. Under Jacinta's command, the soldiers followed behind her. Anna kept her composure, subtly scanning her surroundings. She quickly located a safe exit and waited for the right moment. Jacinta followed closely, exuding confidence as if victory was already within her grasp. Who would have expected them to launch a surprise attack from here? Suddenly, a noise echoed from up ahead. Everyone tensed and raised their weapons. Moments later, the guttural snarls of zombies erupted from all around. This was exactly the moment Anna had been waiting for. Suddenly, a zombie bit down on Jacinta's arm, and she reflexively fired a shot. Under the cover of her subordinates, Jacinta panicked and retreated. Anna felt her way along the wall, running toward the safety exit, only to find that the door wouldn't budge. Behind her, several zombies were already closing in. For a brief moment, Anna felt despair, but she quickly snapped out of it and turned to run back. Jacinta and her team had already retreated to the entrance. Seeing through Anna's plan, Jacinta deliberately closed the metal gate before Anna could reach it.
Dixon will kill you. No. God is on our side. God gave up on us a long time ago.
As soon as she finished speaking, a zombie bit down on Anna's shoulder, but Anna gritted her teeth and didn't make a sound. Although she felt a tinge of regret for not being able to completely trap the team, she had no regrets about her decision. Jacinta's group had suffered heavy casualties. They had no choice but to abandon the mission and retreat. Meanwhile, Ash was testing the plane's engine to see if it was functioning properly. Elsewhere, Jacinta led her team back to the hall. They were utterly disheartened by their situation. The mission had failed, and Jacinta herself had been bitten by a zombie. Just then, she heard a commotion outside. Jacinta's expression lit up with sudden hope, and she hurriedly led her subordinates toward the source of the noise. Ash's test was quickly completed, but the results weren't promising. The carburetor malfunctioned, forcing Ash to step out of the plane to make repairs. Fallow and Cadron stood on guard nearby when the sound of an engine caught their attention. A moment later, a motorcycle appeared behind them. The enemy had found their location. Fallow and Cadron were ready to engage, but the motorcycle immediately turned around and sped away. Daryl grabbed his weapon and turned to reassure Laurent, saying, "Leave here without worry, I'll find you soon." At that moment, Jacinta's team arrived and launched an attack. Dodging and returning fire, Cadron held his ground, his aim steady even with a single hand on his gun. Luckily, there was cover nearby. Cadron and Fallow took turns firing and successfully eliminated one of the snipers on the stands. Under the group's protection, Laurent was safely escorted onto the plane, with Carol following shortly after. The parting came too suddenly, and Carol and Daryl didn't have time to say goodbye. Watching the plane start up successfully, Daryl turned and ran to the back. He called over Cadron and Fallu to help him push the starting gate toward the runway to block part of the advancing attack. Meanwhile, Jacinta's team was making their way toward the racetrack. Everyone braced for action, prepared for a decisive showdown with Daryl. Before the three of them could push the starting gate far enough, they saw the convoy rushing towards them. Cadron hurled a grenade with all his strength, destroying the lead vehicle equipped with a heavy machine gun. The cars behind it stopped in a hurry, and they took out their weapons and started attacking. Despite Jacinta's superior firepower, Daryl and his team's suppressive attack left them struggling to find an opening. Daryl fought with everything he had, buying as much time as possible for Ash and the others. Thanks to Daryl's relentless cover, the plane made it onto the runway. Those aboard the plane were worried as they watched Daryl and the others struggling to hold their ground. The battle raged on. When Daryl glanced back and saw the plane still stationary, he wondered if something had gone wrong. At the same time, Jacinta spotted the plane parked in the distance, a golden opportunity. She immediately ordered her forces to flank and encircle it. Ash pushed the throttle, and the plane began accelerating steadily down the runway. But a motorcycle suddenly raced toward the plane at full speed. Daryl fired several shots to stop it, but all of them missed. He quickly gave chase. The motorcycle was fast. It soon rushed onto the runway and tried to intercept the plane with full power. Laurent shouted a warning, but there was nothing anyone aboard the plane could do. They could only watch helplessly as the rider opened fire. Daryl arrived just in time. Kneeling on one leg to steady his sniper rifle, Ash barely had a moment to celebrate when a mountain buggy sped out and blocked the plane's path. Daryl exhaled deeply, calmed his mind, and aimed for the buggy's driver, but two soldiers on the side suddenly attacked him with precise shots. Daryl took them both down with one bullet each. The plane still wasn't moving fast enough. Ash was desperate, knowing that if they didn't take off now, they were all doomed. At the critical moment, Daryl's sniper rifle ran out of bullets. Ash, gritting his teeth, pushed the throttle to its limit for a final desperate attempt. As Ash's plane was about to collide with the mountain bike, Daryl had to make sure that he hit the target. Suddenly, the plane lifted off smoothly, and everyone finally breathed a sigh of relief. But the co-pilot seat was empty. Carol was gone. It was Carol who had fired the crucial shot. Daryl exhaled deeply, his emotions too complex to put into words. Carol and Daryl took their weapons and met in the middle. Together, they watched the familiar plane disappear into the sky. The battle on the other side continued, with Fallu and Cadron struggling to hold their ground. However, in the next moment, Jacinta's entire team collectively looked upward, their attacks coming to a complete halt. Jacinta's heart sank to the bottom. The plane had successfully taken off, which meant Laurent had left France. In that instant, all her obsessions and faith crumbled into nothing. A gunshot rang out. Carol and Daryl immediately turned to look back, guessing that Jacinta had taken her own life to atone. This woman had done a lot of evil, and it was quite reasonable for her to choose such an ending. The plane soared over the Parisian skyline just as it had upon arrival, with hopes that Ash and Laurent's journey would be safe and smooth. The war between religion and the gangs was finally over. Laurent's departure was likely to bring some stability to the region over time. The remaining group drove away from the racetrack. Arriving at a farmhouse by evening, they decided to rest there for the night and discuss their next destination. Fallu stayed back to close the gates. Only after doing so did he join the others, saying, "2 more people are coming later. We'll leave together in the morning." Fallu took out his luggage and then struck up a conversation with Aquila beside him. He had heard that the situation in post-apocalyptic Britain was somewhat better and invited her to join him on the journey, but Aquila declined. She had just arrived in Paris and hadn't yet found her sister, Jamila, so she wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. At that moment, the gate creaked open, and Daryl instinctively raised his crossbow.
Fallu, maybe your pals could stop pointing those things at us?
Fallu smiled and stepped forward to greet the newcomers. These were the people they were expecting: Fiona and Angus, a couple from England who could guide them on the next leg of their journey. After Fallu's introductions, the two sides exchanged brief pleasantries. Fiona and Angus walked over, carrying their prey. Angus popped open a supply crate and, upon seeing canned goods and bottles of wine, both he and Fiona grinned. These items would be more than enough to get through checkpoints. Angus even pulled out a bottle of red wine, intending to pair it with the game for dinner. 2 hours later, the group gathered around a campfire in the courtyard and shared a simple meal. Naturally, the apocalypse became the main topic of conversation. The couple talked about their fascination with France, marveling at its history and culture. As an outsider himself, Fallou agreed with their sentiment but admitted that life in France wasn't exactly comfortable. Before the apocalypse, Fallou had worked at a hospital. His neighbor, a descendant of nobility, constantly nitpicked and found faults with him. After the neighbor lost his job, he would frequently get drunk and hurl insults at Fallou, telling him to go back to where he came from. But when the apocalypse struck, everything changed. One day, that neighbor knocked on Fallou's door, holding his unconscious 2-year-old daughter and pleading for help. Fortunately, Fallou managed to save the girl just in time, clearing her airway. When she opened her eyes and saw him, she smiled.
And the father?
He took her and left, but I saw gratitude in his eyes.
The apocalypse put an end to racism.
After Angus finished speaking, the atmosphere became awkward in an instant. Fiona quickly patted Angus on the leg, signaling that such behavior was very impolite. Fallou was magnanimous. He admitted that the apocalypse might have brought some kind of change, saying, "Now, there are only 2 kinds of people left, those who are alive and those who are dead." Sensing the mood growing heavy, Aquila suddenly announced that she needed to fetch some firewood. She stood up and headed toward the barn. Fallou called out to her, offering to go alone. Inside the barn, Aquila prodded him for the rest of the story. When she learned that Fallou had barely survived that winter, she pulled him close and kissed him. After spending so much time together, Aquila had also fallen in love with Fallou, but they would part ways tomorrow, and she felt an overwhelming sense of reluctance in her heart. Meanwhile, back at the campfire, the others were bidding each other goodnight and heading off to rest. Soon, only Daryl and Cadron were left by the fire. They were once enemies, now teammates, sharing this rare moment of peace together. Cadron broke the silence, apologizing for what had happened with Isabelle. He explained that he knew the pain of losing family and had only wanted justice for his brother.
No kidding, sure. I didn't kill him. That girl beat me to it.
What girl?
A skinny girl on the road. She was with some old guy who he tricked me into thinking he was blind.
But when the truth was revealed, Cadron felt as though his entire world had collapsed. He had caused so much harm, lost so much, and, in the end, had been seeking revenge against the wrong person. While Daryl hadn't given him all the details, Cadron believed that Daryl's account was the true version of events. Looking at the cross in his hands, Cadron suddenly felt grateful that he had held onto a shred of faith that had stopped him from causing even greater harm. With their misunderstanding resolved, Daryl went to find Carol. He noticed that his old friend seemed troubled and wanted to check on her. Daryl, as always, comforted Carol, saying that those visions were just illusions. Whether it was the people who were lost or the events of the past, none of it was her fault.
None of that's your fault. We keep going. Alright? That's what we do.
At the critical moment when the plane was leaving, Carol chose to stay behind with Daryl. Together, they decided to find another way home, planning to head to Britain and try their luck. As for why they chose Britain, here's a bit of backstory. In the final episode of the previous season, Laurent had mentioned that fishing boats in Britain could ferry people to Canada. Daryl gave up on that opportunity then, but this time, Fallou went out of his way to find guides for the journey. The couple from England, Fiona and Angus, knew the route and could lead them through the Channel Tunnel. Fallou walked at the back of the group. Just the night before, he and Aquila had confessed their feelings for each other. But now, they were still facing the reality of parting ways. Aquila was staying behind to search for her sister, Jamila, while Fallou planned to go to Britain to start a new life. Though the future was uncertain, having a goal to work toward was better than wandering aimlessly in the apocalypse. As he walked, Fallou suddenly figured everything out.
Bon courage, mes amis. I know you will get where you are going.
Fallou turned to look back at Aquila, who was still standing in place, watching him leave. It seemed she was also waiting for him to make up his mind. Turning back to Daryl and the others, Fallou announced, "I have a reason to stay now." Seeing Fallou find his sense of purpose, everyone smiled and offered their blessings. After fighting side by side for a year, Fallou and Daryl had built a deep bond, but as the saying goes, all good things must come to an end. Fallou needed to pursue his own path. As they approached the entrance to the tunnel, Daryl turned back one last time to see Falu and Aquila standing together in the distance. Finally reassured, he caught up with the group and entered the dark, cavernous channel tunnel, but they had barely gone 200 meters when the shrill cries of bats echoed above them. Fortunately, the creatures were not aggressive, so the group quickly let down their guard. They continued for another 5 kilometers when cracks began to appear in the tunnel ceiling. Seawater dripped steadily through the fissures, making the environment increasingly tense and nerve-wracking. Noticing their unease, Angus tried to reassure them, explaining that every 500 meters, there was a yellow safety door that led to a secondary escape tunnel.
Only 91 to go.
No, hold up.
That must be a checkpoint.
English? Why so close to France?
To keep out the French.
Hey, relax, man.
Hearing Angus's tone grow snide again, Cadron immediately issued a warning to him. Fiona quickly stepped in to smooth things over, saying that she would go to the checkpoint and shout, so that the people inside would be more accommodating. With that, the earlier friction came to an end, and the group followed Fiona forward.
We're British. Please don't shoot. We come bearing gifts. Angus, get it. Get thanks.
They called out a few times but received no response, which left them feeling uneasy. A moment later, they discovered that the soldiers stationed on the high platforms were already dead. Clearly, a battle had taken place here before. Worried that the barricade might harbor further dangers, Daryl knocked on the warning plate to test for any sounds from within. When none came, he signaled the group to get ready and began removing the chains securing the barricade. In such a dark and confined environment, even without zombies, they had to remain on guard for ambushes. Once inside, they discovered numerous tents and electrical facilities. It was evident this had once been a military camp, now abandoned. As the lights flickered on, the bodies strewn across the ground became visible. Daryl examined the dead soldiers carefully. They were armed with guns but had knife wounds through their skulls, suggesting they had been killed off guard. This also implied the soldiers had died in a mutual slaughter. Pulling back the tarp on one of the tents, Daryl found 2 gas masks beneath it. He immediately realized the danger these soldiers had been prepared but still fell victim to something. Clearly, this place was fraught with danger. Daryl quickly called his teammates to leave, but as he pushed open the next barricade, the sight before them stunned everyone. The tunnel ahead shimmered with fluorescent light, appearing both eerie and beautiful. They couldn't help but feel curious about what these things might be.
Some animals and plants generate their own light.
Like fireflies.
Yeah.
Just then, a fluorescent zombie made a noise. Judging by its uniform, it had once been a soldier, but the environment had mutated it. Daryl quickly gathered his companions, urging them to stay close. Taking the lead, he guided them swiftly through the tunnel, reassuring them that as long as they were cautious, the zombies wouldn't be easily alerted. But they underestimated the effect of the glowing dust in the air. After only a few steps, Carol began to feel dizzy, her vision growing blurred. She thought she was the only one experiencing symptoms. However, in the next moment, Angus collapsed to the ground. Fiona quickly rushed to pull her husband up. Unfortunately, their actions alerted the surrounding zombies. Daryl quickly turned around, spotting a zombie rising with a roar. He prepared to retreat the way they had come, but trouble had already found Angus and Fiona. The fight broke out unexpectedly, and the group swiftly adjusted, engaging the zombies in battle. Daryl's crossbow was as reliable as ever, but more zombies appeared in the distance. Seeing that his teammates are still fighting behind him, he can only try his best to kill as many zombies as possible. Switching to his flail, Daryl moved to intercept the next wave. But then, his vision began to blur, and the zombies before him twisted and distorted. For a moment, he couldn't tell if what he was seeing was real or just a hallucination. Testing reality was simple enough, though. Meanwhile, Carol fought with her characteristic calm, dispatching zombies without hesitation, but as she drew her knife to strike, she froze in place. She saw Sophia, turned into a zombie, walking toward her just as she had so many times before. And just like all those times, Carol found herself unable to act. Holding her knife with trembling hands, Carol hesitated, her eyes darting around in search of her daughter. When she saw Sophia disappear through the safety door, Carol instinctively followed. It wasn't just Carol, the other teammates were also succumbing to the hallucinations. Cadron looked down at the weapon in his hand, only to see it transform into the long blade that had killed his brother. In the distance, the zombie transformed into the image of his brother, grabbing Kadran by the collar and preparing to bite him. Daryl, having just killed the last zombie in his vicinity, glanced over and saw Kadran trapped in his delusion. Daryl acted swiftly, swinging his flail to knock the zombie down and quickly finishing it off with his dagger. Caught off guard, Daryl was struck by Kadran, who then took a step back and picked up a handgun from the ground. It was clear Kadran had murder in his eyes. Before Kadran could react, Daryl immediately rushed forward and locked his arm around Kodran's neck, but Kodran's strength was immense, and he managed to brace himself and stand upright. Daryl tried to choke Kadran into unconsciousness, but he couldn't overpower him. Kadran overpowered him, slamming Daryl to the ground and quickly stabbing him with a bayonet. Suddenly, Kodran's gaze snapped upward. Kadran suddenly looked up and saw his brother's figure appear in the distance. He immediately abandoned his attack, shouting his brother's name as he ran after it. Daryl narrowly survived the attack. Gasping for air, he knew he couldn't afford to be controlled by hallucinations. Finding a gas mask was his only option. Struggling to his feet, he staggered toward the nearest tent. Elsewhere, Carol had passed through the safety door and was wandering the empty passage, searching for her daughter. She refused to believe it was a hallucination and desperately wanted to see Sophia again, even if only for a moment. But as she walked, Sophia was suddenly swallowed by a swarm of dark shadows. Carol frantically searched, only to see a mass of zombies. The next moment, she saw herself among them, her zombie self, snarling with a hideous expression. The sight was too horrifying. Carol shook her head, trying to dispel the illusion, and finally snapped back to reality. Realizing the danger ahead, Carol placed her flashlight on the ground and drew her knife, ready to fight. Looking at herself turned into a zombie, Carol really couldn't bring herself to do it. Her inner torment had always been rooted in her daughter's tragic fate. But at its core, Carol's struggle was with herself. She had never forgiven herself, repeatedly revisiting the image of Sophia as a zombie in the barn. In truth, the person who had turned into a walking corpse had long since shifted from being Sophia to being Carol herself. After what felt like an eternity, Carol finally lowered her knife. It was a symbolic gesture of self-forgiveness. For a mother, time doesn't erase grief, but it can help her find balance. Carol lifted her head slowly and began to cry. The tears flowing freely, she saw Sophia standing in the distance, her familiar, sweet smile lighting up her face.
It's been so long. Can I come with you?
Sophia didn't respond. She simply withdrew her hand slowly, silently expressing her refusal. Then she turned and walked toward the unknown depths of the tunnel. Carol smiled through her tears, watching her daughter disappear into the darkness. It felt like a burden she had carried for so long had finally been lifted. For the first time, Carol felt at peace. Carol reclaimed her earliest memories, and perhaps from now on, she would no longer be tormented by that nightmare. Meanwhile, Daryl stumbled into the tent and successfully found the 2 gas masks. Suddenly, Angus dropped his weapon, picked up one of the masks, and handed it to his wife. The Angus couple had disappeared shortly after the fight began. It turned out they had been hiding here all along. Daryl was already wounded from a knife attack, and after inhaling excessive dust and being ambushed, his consciousness began to blur. In that moment, teetering on the brink of death, a figure with a long rifle slung over their back appeared in his line of sight. The silhouette felt strangely familiar to Daryl. It was Isabelle, just as she had appeared when he first met her, walking slowly toward him.
That there's nothing left inside you. You think it's over. But you won't die here.
For a fleeting moment, Daryl considered giving up, surrendering to the illusion and losing himself in it. But Isabelle spoke to him with earnest encouragement. She reached for the dog tags around his neck, a token reserved for soldiers. Daryl turned his head to see a figure of a soldier standing nearby. The tags didn't belong to him but to William Dixon, Daryl's grandfather, who had died in France during World War II. At this moment, William Dixon's appearance served only to remind his descendants not to bow to adversity but to strive to keep living. Daryl's awareness snapped back. Instinctively, he grabbed a shovel and swung it at the man across from him with all his might. Again and again, Fiona screamed in horror, rushing at Daryl in a frenzy. He easily overpowered her, throwing her to the ground and gripping her throat tightly. Daryl held the reclaimed gas mask, gasping for air. It was a long while before he slowly regained his senses. Daryl suddenly realized that Isabelle was still watching him from a short distance away.
Bon courage, Monsieur Dixon.
Isabelle was about to leave. It wasn't the ending Daryl had hoped for, but reality was often cruel, like a firefly fading into the night. Isabelle disappeared, fulfilling their final promise to each other. 5 minutes later, Carol returned the same way she had come. With her strong willpower, she overcame the hallucinations and successfully reunited with Daryl. Seeing the two bodies on the ground, Carol didn't need an explanation to understand what had happened. But where was Laurent? Not wanting to worry Carol, Daryl left out the details of the brutal fight, simply saying that Laurent had been affected by the hallucinations and run off. Daryl and Carol exchanged a knowing glance, immediately understanding each other's thoughts.
Let's go home.
The journey ahead was once again left to just Daryl and Carol. The glowing tunnel stretched over 40 kilometers, and they had no idea what dangers might lie ahead or what awaited them on the other side in Britain. All we can do is wait for the next season to unfold.
Try sometimes, you might find